Okay, good evening, everybody. It's 6 o'clock, and so we will reconvene into our Committee of the Whole budget meetings. First of all, Mr. Clerk, do we have a quorum?
Yes, Mayor Patterson, we have quorum.
Okay, are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Councillor Bowman.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you, as I declared in the previous evening, I, Ryan Bowman of the Council of the City of Kingston, declare my pecuniary interest in the matter of clause 5, 6, and 7 of the agenda. As an employee of Utilities Kingston, it may be perceived that I have a conflict with agenda items 5, 6, and 7 and associated bylaws insofar as they relate to Utilities Kingston. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is Councillor Hutchison.
Hello. Okay. As I said previously, I, Rob Hutchison of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston, declare my pecuniary interest in the matter of the City of Kingston 2021 budget, community services, long-term care requisition, as my mother is a resident of Rideau Crest Home, and also Chief Administrative Office, Strategic Initiatives Budget Requisition, as I have family members employed by St. Lawrence College. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Are there any other disclosures of pecuniary interest? Yes, Deputy Mayor Ostroff.
Sorry, Mayor Patterson, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I did not hear the introduction. I had trouble connecting. Do we need to declare the pecuniary interest again? No, thank you. I didn't think so. Okay.
Good to go.
Thank you. I had the same question. Since this was a recess, yesterday's passes on, right? Perfect. Thank you very much. Sorry.
All right, very good. So we have no delegations this evening. So we move to our presentations in a moment. I just wanted to say we pushed fairly hard last night. My intention tonight is looking at our agenda. I don't want us to get into budget deliberations at 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. So I will watch our time and see where we are, but I will say probably after 9 o'clock. At some point, I will be looking until tomorrow. If by some chance we move through all the presentations early and we're into budget deliberations by 9 o'clock or shortly after, that's fine. But in the event that, and I think that that's less likely, but in the event we go later, we will reconvene again tomorrow at 6. Okay, just wanted to just give everyone a heads up on that. So with that, we will move to number 4 on our agenda this evening, which is the municipal operating and capital budget. And so we will turn the floor over to our treasurer, Ms. Kennedy. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to night number 2 of the 2021 budget deliberations. I thought I would start off tonight with just revisiting a couple of questions that came up last night and some outstanding information that staff wanted to provide to council just to catch us back up. So if I could have the clerk move to the next slide. There were a couple of things that were outstanding. There was a question on the safe restart monies and the amounts that we received. CIO Hurdle confirmed last night the 2021 amounts, but on the slide now in before you, you'll see also what we've received for 2020. So under the safe restart monies for the general municipal stream, you'll see we received in phase 1, $7.2 million. And an additional $5.4 million for phase 2 that was based on the application that we submitted last fall. Those funds have to be used for 2020. There was an ability at one point to transfer unused phase 1 funds over, but because we applied and said that the phase 1 basically was not enough, we've received the phase 2. At this point, it's only good until the end of December 2020. So there's none of that in the 2021 budget. The 2021 budget does have $1.4 million showing that we also received, that all municipalities received an amount that was specific to the 2021 budget. In the transit stream is a little bit different in terms of the timing. We received $5.3 million for phase 1 of the transit stream, which was from April 1st until September 30th. And then we've received a phase 2, which is up to $10.6 million, which is for October 1st until March 31st. So we have, based on our calculations, kept 1.8 million of that we have shown in the budget, which basically represents any of our revenue shortfalls for transit from January 1st of 2021 till March 31st of 2021. The transit stream we will have to report back on, and we will have to refund the monies if they're not used. We do not anticipate being able to use all of the transit stream monies that we've received. And we continue to do some calculations on that. We are hoping, and we have done some staff groups, particularly my treasurer's group, has lobbied the Ministry of Transportation to extend that March 31st deadline, because as you know, we have transit challenges, budget challenges for transit going right through 2021 with our reduced revenues. So we are hoping that perhaps the ministry will consider extending that date. But at this point, we can only use those monies up until March 31st of 2021. And then we also received a total of social services relief funding totaling 4.6 million. And you will hear tonight from the commissioners, we have about 2.1 million that's within our 2021 budget, with some offsetting expenses against that. The second outstanding item was there was a request about the assessment value that we use when we're calculating the per household for the tax rate increase. And there was a request of what it would be for 491,000, which is the average house price from MLS at September 2020. So based on that, with a 2.4% increase, the increase per household for an average residential property based at $491,000 value would be about $132 in comparison to the 88 based on the assessed value that we use from MPAC. Next slide. Mine go. The other thing that I just wanted to provide a bit of information to council on, based on some of the discussion last night, was a bit of background on the working fund reserve. And it's probably been a while since we've talked about this in terms of the policy for the working fund reserve. So I thought I'd just do a bit of a summary on that. You'll see in the council report that we are projecting the balance of the working fund reserve at the end of 2021 to be about $7.3 million. So that's based on projections for what we're using it for in 2021 in the budget, as well as some outstanding commitments that we have that have not yet been paid. We tend to look at a target balance of around 2.5% of our annual operating budget to keep in the working fund reserve, which would be around $9 or $10 million. At 7.3, we're at about 1.8% of our roughly $400 million operating budget. And we compare that, if you think about your household budget and the revenues you have coming in, what you'd want to have in your savings account for those unanticipated costs that might come up. The working fund, per our existing policy, is intended to be a financing tool, primarily for one-time type circumstances, uncontrollable expenses, unanticipated expenses that are generally non-recurring. We have in the past used it for phasing in impacts of things under that non-recurring category. More specifically, it is to be used per the policy for some of those items that we do not have control over when council is setting the budget, things like our winter control and other expenditure stabilization items, market impacts for things like fuel costs, if fuel costs went up significantly that was not anticipated, investment income, and perhaps provincial or federal funding amounts if they were unknown at budget time. It's also used to fund any deficits that we might have, and alternatively, surpluses go into the working fund reserve to offset that. And as you heard last night, I believe there was a question with the police about what would happen because they don't have a similar type reserve. And they said that would fall back into the city reserves, which is correct, particularly for police and library that are all part of our reserve structure. Any unanticipated shortfalls for anything specific would come from the working fund reserve. And then finally, assessment growth variances. So where we have in the past estimated what our assessment growth was, and it turned out to be something significantly different. If it couldn't be absorbed within the budget, it would come from the working fund reserve. And I don't think since I've been here, we've had to use the working fund reserve for that, but it's certainly allowed by policy. So I did list on the screen just a few of the previous uses that you just to jog everybody's memory in terms of what we've used the working fund reserve in the past for. Certainly more recently, I'd say in the last 2 or 3 years, the County of Frontenac reconciliation payment that council approved for the 2019 and 2020 budget last year came out of the working fund. The Briar contribution, one of the larger ones was the Eastern Ontario Cell Gap and Capacity Expansion project that went to EORN, and you can see some of the other items listed there. So just wanted to give you a bit of background of that. I think it's been a while since we've talked about that at council. Next slide. Actually, you can go one more slide after that. So I thought I've had a few questions on the budget engagement process, and I thought I'd just take a few minutes to wrap up that process and give council a bit of an update as to how it went and some of the feedback that we got. There is quite a bit of information in the council report. You will see the structure of the information in the report was really to report back to council and to the public as to how we used the feedback. So what was the feedback and how did it impact and influence the 2021 operating and capital budget? So you'll see the report has been structured that way. For those that want to see lots of detail, there's quite a large appendix or exhibit C that gives you lots of detail on the survey, on some of the polls that we did, and probably more importantly, the comments that came with the 2 open-ended questions that we included in the survey. I can say overall, it was an interesting process. It was actually exciting to be able to launch this and to have the virtual open houses, to set up the Get Involved Kingston page, to do the survey. I think the disappointing part was the number of participants that we had. We had 379 people do the survey, which wasn't too bad. Actually, I was pleasantly surprised at that. It would have been nice to have more. I believe there was something like 60 plus people on the virtual open house calls that we did. We did 2 different nights, but I can tell you probably more than half of those were city staff that were sitting in on it. So very disappointing in terms of the participation in the open house, but I think overall, they certainly went well, and we did get some good questions at the end in terms of that presentation on 2 different nights. The one little colored chart here that I've put on, I've included, it's also in the exhibit to the report, and it's talked about in the report with some of the other questions that we asked. But this one I found quite interesting. So this was done as part of the survey. So we had 379 people that responded on this one. And the question being, which options should the city consider when developing the budget? And the options they had were to keep the tax increase at an inflationary level in order to maintain services, to increase taxes to expand and enhance services, to cut services to reduce taxes, and then there was an undecided and an other. Not sure exactly what was coming out of the other, but what I did find interesting is that between the keep the taxes increases at the inflationary level to maintain the services and to increase taxes to expand, we had almost 70% between those 2. I would say that doesn't necessarily align with some of the comments that we saw in the survey, and I don't have an explanation for why that is. But I thought this was certainly an interesting one from my perspective in terms of some of the feedback that we got. One of the things I can also just offer in terms of a perspective in terms of this process, we had a real challenge in setting up the survey questions, and in even some of the presentation that we did for the virtual open house. we found budget is a very broad category, as you know. And we were trying to set the stage, particularly with the survey questions, thinking about what kind of information we could get back that we could use. Recognizing for this first phase one, our timing was a little bit tight, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Excuse me, but it was a bit of a challenge. And I'd say if you look at some of the open-ended questions that are in the exhibit, some of those answers, you will see very, very broad and a lot of different viewpoints on different things. So that was a challenge for this go around. I think the positive side of that is that we have some really good information from this go around that we can use to try to maybe focus in on more specific areas for the next year's process. So staff are continuing to review that and to see what it is maybe we can use in terms of what is it in more specific that people would like to provide input and have some influence over. So that will be part of our next steps. The next slide. I did try to just roll things up, and you'll see this in the council report as well. It was a bit of a challenge with all of the responses to try to come up with some common themes, but there were a few that came out. There were 2 questions within the survey where we asked respondents to pick their top 3 areas where they'd like to see council invest more dollars, and top 3 areas where we'd like the respondents, where they'd like to see council spending or investing less tax dollars. I don't think there was much surprise here in terms of the 3 areas that stood out, and you'll see in the exhibit stood out quite a bit above the others. Certainly the climate change, housing support, and income support. So certainly looking at our vulnerable population. So I don't think any surprise based on some of the challenges that we've seen and that have been have increased with the pandemic. I did list road maintenance and replacement and green spaces as 2 more that weren't too far below the other 3. In terms of where they'd like to see less dollars spent, there was actually only 2 areas that really stood out well above the others. The first one was police, and I would say that was probably the defund police was probably the comment we saw the most throughout all of the open-ended questions. And if you just read through quite quickly, you will see that does stand out quite clearly. Again, probably influenced a bit by the timing of the survey. And the other one was investment in tourism. Behind that, and quite a bit behind, there was sort of a close race for economic development and cultural facilities and programs as well. So it did give us a bit of a feel. And then there were some key messages and themes as you're reading through that did stick out in terms of some commonality. Funding reallocation, definitely a common theme about reallocating funding from other areas to support those priority areas. So the housing, mental health, income support. So there was some messages about how we should be able to take money from somewhere else and reallocate and prioritize. So some good input and feedback on spending management, about spending only on necessities, reducing discretionary expenditures, and postponing lesser priority projects until the economy starts to rebound. There was some service level comments, and I think this is an area that we would like to start to drill down in with the next phase of the engagement. There were some comments around getting out of non-core services, considering what's essential versus nice to have, reducing services to reflect demand, but not losing sight of the vital nature of some services for the well-being of Kingston's more vulnerable citizens. So there are definitely some common themes there about those populations where we need to focus on in terms of some of the services we're providing. There were some couple of interesting comments that I would say are more pandemic specific. One that was in a number of times suggesting that operational processes and modifications that have been made in response to the pandemic should continue to be evaluated for their effectiveness post-pandemic. So things like saving money around remote work, customer service hours, moving to online services where possible, some of those things where potentially we could save money in the longer term that we were forced to do, but perhaps maybe we could come standard going forward. And then finally, there was quite a bit of feedback. We did ask 1 or 2 questions specific to user fees. And there definitely was a commonality around some support to user fee increases, but only in certain areas because there was recurring concerns about raising fees, again, for services that would impact lower income residents. And so again, that was a common theme. So just gives you a little bit of a feel, and certainly welcome to dig into some more of the detail in the numerous pages of Exhibit C. So just quickly, next slide. In terms of the next steps, we are going to be into phase 2. One of the principles that we've been using throughout this and the framework that Council originally approved for us is that we want to continue to enhance the knowledge of the budget process and how it works with the public, but we also want to continue to increase the level of feedback and the opportunities for feedback. So this year really was a lot about getting the information out there for people and some feedback. We'd like to move along that continuum line a little bit. So continue to do that, but really start to increase the opportunities for feedback. And we did set up, I think in the original framework that we provided to Council, we talked about 3 particular elements and we created these in terms of trying to figure out how we did scope the process to something that was going to be useful and provide some feedback that could impact our budgets going forward. So we've got the 4 elements: strategic priorities and investment. So continuing to check in on the support for those priorities and potentially the level of investment between those priorities. Service levels, I think, is a key one for us going forward. So it's not just about reduce the money here, but let's talk about reducing the service level first. So where could we reduce or increase service levels? And then the budget piece would certainly follow from that. Performance, always interested in getting the public's input on where we could improve services and performance, where we can find efficiencies, ideas for revenue generation, cost savings, and that sort of thing. And then finally, project specific. And we have been looking at some specific projects where we could take advantage of the linkage between the preference for the project and how do you allocate fixed resources. So as an example, you take an upcoming park project and we need to buy a bunch of park equipment and we've got $500,000 to do that. So you can't buy the top level slide and swings and have the best of benches. How would you allocate that 500,000? And we see that as being a way where we can start to get into some where people actually can participate and make some of those decisions and be a part of some of that. So that's certainly something that we've got going forward as well. Next slide. So moving into the 2021 operating budget, just at a glance, as I said previously, I was talking about service levels, and if you determine the service levels, the budget follows, and that really is what we do with the operating budget and the capital budget. The budgets now allocate those financial resources that are necessary to accomplish Council's strategic priorities and to reflect Council's direction on service levels and fiscal targets. So Council has numerous discussions throughout the year on these items, and the budget really is just putting the dollars to those at the end of the day. This budget does maintain frontline service levels, certainly with consideration for pandemic impacts, and I will touch base on that in this presentation, and you'll certainly hear more detail from the commissioners this evening. Assumptions for inflation and some growth-related service demand is included. The service level assumptions with respect to the pandemic, generally what we have done is we've made assumptions that our service levels throughout 2021 will be similar to what we had in late 2020. So when we were in the province's green COVID response zone, which was kind of our new normal in the fall. We've used that in terms of our assumptions for what our services would look like in 2021. And that was based on the assumption of a vaccine that hopefully by the end of 2021 will have been administered, and we'll start to get back to more typical service levels. You will hear tonight about services in our projection years, how we are actually phasing back in. And in our projections by 2024, all of our service levels have been assumed to be back to the pre-pandemic at the latest by the end of 2024. You'll also hear, I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about some resource reallocation decisions that have been made, where we've been able to save some money, particularly with human resources, and reallocate to other priorities as part of some of our human resource planning. Next slide, please. So as you heard last night from our CAO, municipal tax increase in the budget of 1.4%, along with 1% incremental capital levy. We have $2.5 million in the budget from assessment growth. That's about 1.1%. We also have about 3.9 million showing from supplementary taxes. And that number reflects some of the information that we've provided to council around the 2020 building activity and building permits. We do track our supplementary taxes, which ultimately turns into our growth in the future years. And based on some of that analysis and some of the permits that have been issued and the healthy amount of permits that have been issued in 2020 has resulted in a fairly significant supplementary tax in 2021. And you'll see in the projections that turns into a very healthy growth projection of about 4.8 million in 2022. So certainly able to see the benefits of the building activity. I will just touch briefly when I get into the taxation section on how we have removed the County of Frontenac services. So if anybody's looking at comparing last year's binder to this year's binder, you'd probably be questioning why all of our total budgets and our total tax revenues are changed. And that is because of the removal of the County of Frontenac services. And then finally, the pandemic impact. We've had an impact in our 2021 budget of about $11 million in terms of reduction of fees and charges revenues. We have direct costs reductions based on those services, those service levels being reduced of about $4 million. And we also have directly related grant revenues, as I touched on earlier, of about $5 million. So you can see we have a net there at a very, very high level of about $2 million of impact that needed to be covered by other municipal operations as staff were working to try to bring this recommended budget to council. So you will hear a few things as I'm going through around some savings in fuel, utilities, other discretionary costs, and a couple other things that we'll touch on throughout the slides. Next slide, please. So we do have a almost $394 million operating budget, gross operating budget for 2021. We still have, even with the $11 million of reductions, we still have about almost $137 million in non-tax revenues. Our payments in lieu, which is our taxation from the upper levels of government, provincial and federal, are about 16.4 million. The growth and supplementary taxes that I've touched on, and so a net taxation requirement of $234 million that's being recommended. Next slide. I thought I would just include a bit of this information. Again, I know there's been some questions, and I've had some questions around comparison with tax rates. As staff, we do monitor what others are doing, particularly at the treasurer's level. I am a member of the regional and single tier treasurers group, and we have a standing agenda item about once a month, and even more often this time of year, where we are looking at tax rates across the board. Regional and single tier, I am probably the smallest municipal representative there. I think Kingston would be our smallest one. Certainly, I'm sitting at the table with Toronto and Ottawa and Sudbury and Hamilton and a number of the regions. But in terms of monitoring this, I think there's 19 of us that participate in this survey, and we continue to update this based on rates that have been targeted by council, rates where we have currently projected if we're in the process, and then final approved rates. And so we continue to update this as councils are doing their deliberations. I can tell you with this group that the target range, and I say actual or target, I ignored most of the current positions because that tends to just be where staff are in terms of their development of the budget, are anywhere from about 1.4% to 4.4%. Some of the municipalities have a dedicated capital levy. I've included in this analysis if they did or didn't, because if they don't have a dedicated one, they've got it within this increase. So I've included that as a consolidated amount. There is one region, sorry, I think it's one county actually, that is targeting a 0%. The majority, I would say, are around the 2%. There's about a 1.4 and a 1.5, and there is a 3.9, I think it is, that are kind of in the outliers. I did list a couple that I thought were more comparable. Certainly Sudbury is one that we do tend to compare. They are at a target right now of 3.9. And I should say most of these municipalities are around the same timing as us in terms of their budget, if not a little bit later. Most of them did actually defer their budget as we did. So we're all around that same timing. So there's quite a few yet that have not gone to council. I did include Guelph. Guelph's not part of this group, but it is another one that's a comparable. And so I tend to add it on the bottom of my analysis. Guelph actually has been approved at 2.25% for 2021. And Ottawa is at 3%. And I'm not sure whether that's been approved yet or not. Excuse me. The other one that our deputy treasurer is a member of is the Eastern Ontario Treasurers Group, and they do something similar. And again, they had a survey that went around. This tends to be a lot smaller municipalities. Kingston tends to be one of the larger ones in this group. But again, you can see an average somewhere around 1.5. Most were in the 1.5 to 2% range. Most of them do not have a capital levy. There were 5 respondents out of the 24 that were targeting a 0%. And then you can see I've listed, excuse me, some of the ones that are just a little closer into our area, that are anywhere from 1.5% to 4%. So certainly all over the map, but I thought that would just give council a little bit of a feel for what we're seeing in some of the other areas. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So this is just I know you can't see this, but I just thought I would reference this. This is budget binder page 7 in your material, and it's also a exhibit to the council report. And I'm just referencing council on this one. This is a really good summary page to look at. And if you're wanting to follow along tonight with the commissioners at a little higher level, because it does show you the by department, it shows the variance from last year to this year. And it also provides you with a look out into the following 3 years. And at the bottom gives you the information on the supplementaries and the growth and some of those corporate things. So just referencing that in terms of a good summary page, if that's useful for following along. We can go a couple more slides, please. Just looking at a little bit of the economic considerations that we looked at. This was a little different year for this because, to be honest, nobody really knows what's going on and what 2021 and 2022 are going to look like. But there certainly is a bit of consensus in some of the discussions that I have been a part of. So certainly looking at CPI, and I left the graph at the top so we could kind of see what volatility we've dealt with, certainly when the pandemic hit and what that did. But certainly looking at the last 3 months or so, 3 or 4 months, we can see that the Ontario CPI has started to level out around that 8, 9.9% up to 1%. And I also have included the information excluding energy. As you can see, energy always does have a big impact on the overall calculation for all items. And because we look at energy quite differently, we pull that out and we look at it separately in terms of some of our expenses in the budget. So taking that one out gives us a little bit more of just a general calculation of what we might use for everything, for all the other expenditure categories. So we did focus on, for those areas where we didn't have specific amounts in terms of escalations, we did use 1% as an assumption for 2021, and we used 2% as an assumption going forward for 2022 and for the rest of the projection years. And that was based on the Bank of Montreal forecasts, which basically had us getting back to actually quite high for 2021, but certainly by 2022 getting us back to the 2%. The other thing in terms of validating some of those numbers is there's certainly been a lot of discussion lately about what GDP growth will look like maybe coming out of 2021 and into 2022. And there is some consensus that people do have savings, that they haven't been able to spend money. And even some of the provincial and federal relief programs, things like the CERB, that actually were putting more money in some people's pockets than they might have had. There is an expectation that once the vaccine is out and we start to see our economy recover, that those savings could drive up consumption and therefore our GDP growth. And of course, that would then affect our CPI. So that's just a little bit of the background as to maybe some of the validation for those numbers. Next slide. So in terms of interest rates, we certainly are struggling with our investment income these days with our municipal investments. The interest rates we don't see changing, and certainly some of the forecasts are saying that the Bank of Canada policy rate, which drives our investment rates, are expected to remain consistent at that 0.25% for 2021 and probably well into 2022. So that's not great news for our investments, but it is great news for some of our outstanding debt that we have yet to issue, that the council has approved and we haven't yet issued. So it hits us on both sides. You will see we have reduced our budget for investment income, our short-term bank investment income, by about $550,000. To reflect some of this reduction in rates that has a bit of a lag in terms of affecting us, but is certainly affecting us now, as well as some of the tax deferral programs that council's been considering, which affects our cash flow. And where we can, we try to finance that internally with our reserve funds, which also means a cost to us in terms of lost investment income. So that has certainly driven that. Our long-term rates are continue to be modeled at 3% within our reserve funds. We have been fairly conservative in the past using 3%. I would say we're not conservative now, but we still feel pretty comfortable we can leave it at 3%. We've just lost that little bit of extra flexibility in there. And certainly US exchange, which does affect some of our expenditures. And currently our US dollar, our Canadian dollar is at $1.27 for US dollar. And the forecasts for 21 and 22 see that staying fairly consistent. So where that is applicable, particularly in some of our capital plans, we have incorporated that in. If I could go 2 more slides, please. So taking a look at just some of the detail, and I'm just going to look at this corporately to give you a feel for what some of our revenues and expenditures are doing corporately. However, you will certainly hear more detail as the commissioners present within their areas, some of the challenges and some of what the decisions that we've made in terms of the 2021 revenues and expenses. You can see here in this graph, certainly, and I will talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that we're having with the PIL revenues, the fees and charges that I've already mentioned. There is some increase in the provincial grants and subsidies, which we'll take a quick look at, but certainly that's in relation to some of the COVID-related funding that we have. So the next slide, please. So in terms of our tax revenues and assessment growth, and I've gone through most of this, but what you will see on this slide is it is just confirming and showing our calculation with respect to removing the County of Frontenac levy. So what we did is we went back to the 2020 budget and we pulled out about $11.1 million, which represented the total amount that we had budgeted in 2020 for both the land ambulance and the Fairmount services. That came out of our tax revenue and that came out of our agency transfers. So if you're comparing to last year's binder, that's where you'll see the difference. Our revenues showed as 239.9 for 2020. We've adjusted them down to 228.8 so that the county is out of 20 and out of 2021. And so you can see that difference creates the 1.4% operating increase. Next slide. So PIL revenues, normally don't have a lot to say on this one. This year, a little bit different. You may recall that the province made a decision in terms of trying to support businesses through the pandemic and through recovery to reduce the business education tax rate quite significantly. Our PIL revenues for some of our PIL properties, we are allowed to retain the education room. So what's collected under the education rate does not go to the school boards. It's actually retained by the municipalities and becomes part of our PIL revenues. So when the province decided to reduce the rate and help all these businesses, there was an unintended consequence in that it actually had a negative effect on the municipalities that were able to keep this money. For us, it was a hit of about $1.2 million. We initially were not going to include this in discussions that we have had both with the province as well as with the some of our contacts that actually in Public Works Canada that actually make these payments. We had some discussions. The province assured us that this was not an intended consequence of the policy change that they did, and that they would ensure that the PILs continued to be paid at the higher rate for business education tax. However, in speaking to Public Works Canada and looking in the federal PIL Act, which is a federal legislation, there is nothing there that says that they have to pay at a different rate. They pay at the taxable rate, which would be the rate that the province has set. And as you know, we've run into this previously in terms because we know that the feds do not use the same assessment value that MPAC provides for these properties. So it's a separate legislation that they control. And so we did have some concern that while the province said they would make sure we were whole, we're not completely convinced that they have the authority to be able to do that. So we did make an adjustment to bring this down. And part of what we used in terms of trying to fund this $1.2 million was we did have some education room that you'll recall the last 2 years, we had some extra education room that we were using to build up some funds for the provincial downloading that we were anticipating before the pandemic hit. And so we were continuing just to put that away each year. And so we've actually taken some of that back out and we've used it against this. If I'm wrong, and I'm really hoping I'm wrong, and we're going to see this $1.2 million, then we'll be able to put that money back into that pool. But we just felt realistically that this was a definite risk, and we feel it's quite a high risk. Unfortunately, it's really mostly City of Ottawa and City of Kingston that get hit with this in terms of the larger amounts because of the federal properties. And to be honest, I know Ottawa felt that that there was a lower risk than we felt here in Kingston, but certainly with some of our discussions with Public Works Canada, we'll be quite surprised if they actually end up paying it. So we decided to book it into the budget for now. There is a couple of other minor adjustments. There is a large added assessment of about $300,000, which actually relates to the Cataraqui Bay sewer plant with the new sewer plant, which has been reassessed and has come on the books for 2021 at a higher amount for the value of that. Next slide. So in terms of fees and charges, I won't get into a whole lot of detail on this. As I said, you'll hear this later on tonight from the commissioners, but we are down about $11 million due to the pandemic. You can see on the slide here, that's made up mostly of transit, recreation and culture, our airport revenues, and some parking revenues. The big category there, the recreation and culture, which we did put together, just in terms of a breakdown there, certainly our ice rentals, which are down about 1.5 million, our recreational programs and our recreational memberships is another million. And then our Leon Center. So we normally get $550,000 from the Leon Center operations, which then gets transferred back out to our capital funds to help cover some of the debt cost. We're not anticipating that $550,000 because there's not a whole lot of activity happening right now at the Leon Center. So we have reduced the that revenue coming in. We've also reduced the offsetting transfer to the capital reserve funds for that $550, and our municipal capital reserve fund will pick that up for 2021. And then there is about $2 million related to culture, primarily the Grand Theater programming and rental activities. Next slide, please. The federal and provincial grants. So I have talked about the pandemic related funding. We have the general stream of 1.5 million. We have a transit stream of about 1.8 million. It's in the budget. We have another about $1.2 million of provincial gas tax, additional provincial gas tax that we have included. This is not because we've got a whole lot of extra gas tax, but what we did do is part of our application to the Safe Restart for 2020, we switched out our provincial gas tax to maximize the Safe Restart funding. There was a bit of a risk here whether this would get accepted. We still will have to do some annual reporting, so there's still a little bit of risk here, but it certainly seemed to be accepted from our application. So we basically did not bring provincial gas tax into our operations starting in April 1st of 2020, and we made use of the Safe Restart funds instead. And now we've been able to bring that provincial gas tax back in. We're bringing some in 2021 and the remainder in 2022. If the province decides to extend that March 31st timeline for the transit stream, we would switch that back out again and make use of the transit stream to the extent that we could, because we can always move the provincial gas tax forward. We can put it into our capital reserve fund and just move it forward and use it as necessary. So it's one of the strategies we use to try to maximize the funds as best we could. And then, as I said, there's also some social services relief monies, and there's some long-term care COVID-related subsidies as well that you'll see in the Rideau Crest budget. There is another $500,000 for our Ontario Works fundings that has been included in the budget with respect to anticipated increases in the Ontario Works payments. And as Council will recall, the last maybe 2 or 3 years, we're in the process of seeing the federal step down funding for housing. But that has continued to, that's being offset by an increase. We had about a $300,000 increase in our federal gas tax this year, which comes into operating and goes right back out to capital. So that helped to offset some of the federal funds there. Next slide. So moving into the operating budget expenditures, I think the one thing that I would draw your attention to here, which shouldn't be surprising based on some of the pandemic impact to the budgets, but you will see that for most of the categories, in particular, our salaries and wages, our materials, supplies and fees, and our contracted services are all going down from 2020 to 2021. What is going up is our grants and transfers to others. And I will touch base on that, but certainly we would expect that particularly in our social services and housing areas, that those would be maintained and would be increasing, as well as our transfers to reserve funds, which is basically our capital strategies that are continuing. Next slide, please. So in terms of wages and benefits, our wages and benefits are going down about $1 million. Within this budget, we have incorporated our collective agreement requirements. So in terms of escalations for our various collective agreements, you will recall, Council recall approving a strategy to address some of the COVID impacts by freezing our non-union salaries. So we have canceled the 2020 performance-based increases, which would be happening by now, as well as freezing of the 2021 council remuneration. that was your decision, not mine. So you've approved that one. We are also showing, obviously, for our reduced service levels in transit, recreation, and culture, we're showing a reduction of about $3 million. Some of that is attrition, where we just have not hired people that have left. A lot of it relates to part-time and overtime costs as well. So most of our full-time staff are certainly still there and being paid, but certainly some of where we've had some discretion around part-time and overtime, we've been able to reduce those by about $3 million. We do have about 750,000 offsetting that. That's strictly related to pandemic for screening, cleaning costs, and some temporary enforcement costs, which you will hear more about. And then finally, we have redirected some of our resources, as I mentioned earlier, to priority areas. So 3 or 4 areas that we've identified. Certainly some of our capital projects, and we'll talk about this a bit when I get to capital, but certainly our ISIP funds and our disaster mitigation fund, some of the grants that we talked about last year that were 8-year programs. There's a lot of capital work happening there, and we have had to hire some project managers to help us through that work. There are very defined timelines for getting that done to be eligible for the monies. So that was the first priority area. You will hear that we've increased, we've got a new garbage and recycling route to address growth requirements. That has been in the projections for the last 2 or 3 years for 2021. So we have moved forward with that, as well as some increased support for the active transportation priorities that Council has approved, and some support to the planning and development activities to address some of our increased volume with applications and building permits, which, as you know, has lent to some of the supplementary taxes and growth that we've got in this year's budget and coming forward. The good news with redirecting some of that, and why I say we're redirecting it, is we've also been able to identify in the staffing complement other areas where we have not hired or where we've moved responsibilities around. And so you will hear tonight from the commissioners where we have reduced positions, particularly in some of our administrative areas, in the clerks, in human resources, in finance, airport, and in social services administration. And that one certainly is directly related to some of the reductions that we know are coming in terms of administrative funding from the province. And so the last couple of years, our director in social services talked about some of the efforts that they've made in terms of processes and efficiencies to try to address this before we get hit with that. So overall, probably at a high level, a savings of about $3 million. No change in terms of some of the staffing complement, probably about $2 million in terms of our regular escalation under our union contracts. And so we're down about $1 million overall. Next slide. So in terms of materials and supplies and contracted services, you can again see in materials and supplies, we have about $750,000 of reduction that I would say directly relates to our reduced services because of the pandemic. Probably about another 100,000, and my deputy treasurer said today I probably have underestimated that a bit. In terms of other, what I would call discretionary cost decreases, we've gone through and we looked at a lot of areas, things like travel and training, meeting costs, those kinds of things that we just know are not going to happen in 2021. Those are costs that are getting phased back in the future years. Fuel, I'm going to talk about in a moment. Utilities is down about $350,000. And you will hear tonight from our Commissioner of Corporate Services talking about their ongoing efforts around a centralized facility maintenance model. And this was the budget year that we took a really close look at how we've been budgeting for our maintenance costs. A lot of costs were within the departments. And so this year, we decided to make that effort to right-size the budgets and to bring them into the facilities area and to charge then a cost back out to the departments that comes, an internal cost that comes allocated from the facility area. So as part of that approach, we certainly the facilities department really took a close look at the utilities and what they should be, and we right-sized some of those budgets. You'll also see the offset to that under contracted services. You'll see a facility investment of $200,000 going up. That is also part of that review. So just trying to right size our maintenance and increasing our maintenance based on some of the life cycle review work that's been done the last couple of years between our internal sources and some of our external backup sources around that. Insurance costs, unfortunately, you heard this last night, I think from 2 or 3 agencies mentioned their insurance costs. As much as we do to try to do all the right things, the costs are still going up, and that is just reflective of the insurance market these days. So that we've had a hit of about $400,000 on that. And then in contracted services, direct service costs, again, about $1 million that would directly relate to our reduced service levels for the pandemic. And then you will hear tonight in solid waste, we've got an increase of about $600,000 with respect to the collection and the garbage and recycling collection for solid waste, and some new contracts which did come to council in the last year, and we're feeling the annual effect of that now in 2021. We did move a couple of things. So for those councillors that I know keep a really close eye on contracted services, this year, I did actually move out our fees to MPAC and our audit fees out of contracted services and into materials and supplies, which is now called materials and supplies and fees, just for those 2 categories that I felt, while for ministry reporting purposes, they have to be in contracted services, they really didn't fit with where we're actually contracting out. We don't have any choice but to pay those fees for those services. And so we have moved those out if you're comparing to last year. Next slide. So the grants and transfers to others, as I said, has gone up. And you'll see this does reflect to the provincial funding. So we do have, with respect to the social services relief funding, we do have about $2.1 million in costs to use that funding, and our CAO will be presenting the social services budget and speaking to that, as well as the Ontario Works amount. We also had some reductions actually in some of our housing payments this year, again related to some of the pandemic related items. The rent supplements, there's a provincial mandate on the freeze on residential rent increases for 2021, so that has affected that. And then we've also had some same thing with the housing providers in terms of some of the changes to the benchmark. So more detail to come on that later tonight. And then finally, transfers to reserve funds. I think I've covered with respect to the 1% capital levy, the increase of about $340,000 for the federal gas tax. And because we're not getting the Leon Center contribution as a revenue, we're not transferring to the capital reserve fund that same amount. Next slide. So in terms, I just wanted to touch base on fuel budgets. We reported, I believe, in the third quarter report, we are anticipating, I think it was a little bit less than $2 million, but we are expecting about a $2 million surplus in fuel, give or take, by the time we close out the books for 2020. Roughly $1 million of that relates to volume, certainly because we didn't have transit buses on the road, and another $1 million of that relates to price of fuel, which certainly has been down throughout the pandemic. In terms of going forward, you'll see our fuel is only going down about $270,000. In terms of the volume, we did a monthly analysis of the volume, and because we have made an assumption that our service levels for 2021 will be in line with the fall 2020 service levels, and then transitioning back throughout the year and into 2022, that worked out about the same as to what we had in our budgets for 2020. So there was no adjustment made for volume. And part of that is because our January, February, before the pandemic, would be higher months because we have the students, and those happened as normal. But then some of the lower months coming in the summer were the ones where we got hit, but they weren't as high in the budget. So on average, it worked out about the same. So the volume, there's no adjustment. The fuel prices, so the $1 million of fuel price, which we've dropped about 25% of that variance. Another 25% of that variance relates to the federal carbon tax, which is increasing each year. And that affects us by about, I think it's about 3 cents a liter on our diesel fuel. And so we have incorporated about $250,000 of that into the budget for 2021. And that leaves us about $500,000, which I have left in as to help with some of the risk of price volatility in 2021. We have no idea what's going to happen to fuel. Certainly keeping an eye on it the last couple of weeks. It's jumped back up again at the pumps, at least the regular when I'm filling my car up. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't leave that too tight, which is what we've been our standard practice in the past. So we have left about $500,000 within the fuel budget, just to address the risk of what might happen in 2021. Next slide, please. So in terms of our multi-year operating forecasts, you can see for 22, 23, and 24, we have a gap in 2022 of 0.7%, 0.9%, and 0.6% for 23 and 24. Those are cumulative amounts. So you can see where I've accumulated them on the right-hand column. But if we find, and we will find, $1.6 million of expenditure gap in 2022, if that's sustainable solutions, then that will go towards our 3.6, and we'd only be looking for another 2 million. So that just gives you an idea of what some of our outer years are looking like. Certainly a lot of risk in terms of our assumptions and what those outer years are going to look like, as hopefully we're in the post-pandemic era by then. We may have some adjustments. We are phasing back to pre-COVID service levels throughout at least 2022 and 2023, and so that's in there. There are some operating costs for our new facilities coming back online, the East End Community Center, as well as our new fleet maintenance garages as they come online late in 2021 and then annualized into 2022. And then, of course, we continue to have challenges with some of our provincial funding changes to Housing Ontario Works and the step down federal funding for the housing programs. There is nothing in the projected years from the transit business plan. We did have, I believe it was phase 4, was in there for, I think, 2021 and maybe 2022. That has all been removed at this point. And certainly we're waiting to see what transit's going to look like in terms of our recovery phase, and then what it's going to look like going forward. So those any of those amounts have been pulled out of previous years where they've been in the projections. And if I can go a couple of slides more. So this is just, again, reference Exhibit A to the council report with respect to the capital budget. If you're looking for a good summary of the capital budget, this is it. It does provide you with the first page in terms of by department, the total costs and how those costs are funded by department. And then the subsequent pages gives you more detail if you want to go in and see exactly what types of projects and funding envelopes that we've got. Next slide. So just at a high level in terms of our capital budget and funding, we have a $62 million capital budget. This is a very small capital budget, particularly when almost a third of it relates to the home energy program, which we'll look at in a minute. So if you take that out, we're probably closer to maybe 44 million or so. So a very lean budget. As part of doing our capital budget this year, we took a very, very close look at what was in our works in progress, particularly because in 2020, a lot of projects, some deferred by council, but a lot of work that just was getting deferred or taking a little longer to do throughout the pandemic. So certainly some of our timing got thrown off. So the departments took a very, very close look at what was in works in progress. Rather than asking to have anything closed, We've kept the works in progress as is, but there is a focus to get some of that work done before we're starting anything new. So as a result, our 2021 budget is $62 million. You can see that a good chunk of that is coming from our municipal capital reserve funds as pay-as-you-go. There is no issuance of long-term debt, which is what we projected last year for this budget, and we're not projecting anything for the rest of council's term in terms of new long-term debt being approved for our capital budgets. You'll also see almost 21 million of government grants. In terms of prioritizing 2021, where we do have grant monies to be used, obviously those were priority and have been built into 2021 and the future years. And so that's reflected as well here in the funding. Next slide. So just to remind council, we did have 3-year capital plans approved for engineering and transportation in 2020. So you won't see any budgets for them in 2021. They have already been approved. As I said, we did have a targeted focus on our works in progress as a result of some of the pandemic disruption. There is some deferral that you'll hear tonight around some of our transit and fleet replacements where we were able to push the replacements out. And continued investment, obviously, in council's strategic priorities, investment in our grant-supported projects. And you will see in our asset management envelope some increased investment, as I mentioned earlier, in facilities as one of those priority areas from an asset management perspective that we are trying to increase the investment in. And if you look in our 15-year capital plan, you will see both our facilities and our engineering as we're working on some of our asset management plans, we are trying to increase our investment in those asset management envelopes. Next slide, please. So just a quick breakdown in terms of our capital expenditures. Under strategic priorities, climate change, that should just say climate change, is $20 million. The majority of that is the home energy program, which I'm sure you'll hear more about tonight from Commissioner Hugenboss, as well as some housing costs that are in there. Keep in mind, in terms of housing, it's only $2.5 million. However, we already had a commitment that council had approved of around $20 million previously for housing, which is representing, I believe it's 172 housing units, and you'll hear more from our CAO about that later. The grant-related projects, about another $4 million, and then our asset management and life cycle costs, the majority you can see certainly in facilities, but a total of $34 million. And then a couple of million that you did hear about last night from our agencies, particularly the police, library, and Kingston Access bus that are in there. Next slide, please. So just a reminder in terms of our multi-year grant applications, and we talked about this last year, we are underway with our Investing in Canada Infrastructure program, which was about $100 million envelope of projects over the next 6 years now for active transportation initiatives. 73% of grant funding, and our first round of applications was approved last year for about $48 million of that 100. And so we're off and running, and those are all included within either WIP or the current year. The Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, which was $50 million with $20 million of grant fund, and that's funding for the shoreline protection and combined sewer separation and stormwater projects. Some of that would be in the Utilities Kingston. That's also included either within our WIP or within the 15-year capital plan. And so those have been incorporated according to the timelines. We do adjust that as we get closer to doing some of the applications, particularly on the ISIP. In the projected years, we sometimes will move some of that funding around to ensure that we're maximizing that as best we can. I didn't list on here the COVID-19 ISIP funding. So the Investing in Canada Infrastructure did introduce a COVID-19 fund in 2020, and we did apply and were successful. We've got about $2.3 million we were eligible for, and so we did apply for some projects at Rideau Crest, as well as some park projects and some outdoor activity projects, and those were either projects that we already had in WIP but hadn't started, or they're included excuse me, in the 2021 capital budget. So you'll hear more about that. Next slide, please. So just taking a quick look at the projected debt. So you will see, and you've seen these numbers before, we have debt that's been issued to date, and this is our numbers at year end for December 31st. So we have debt that's issued and we're making payments on of just about $384 million. We have about 136 million of debt that, excuse me, council has approved, but we have not yet issued. So we have a total of about $520 million once everything is issued. We are making payments of about $17–18 million right now a year on the debt that has been issued. And so not planning any debt for 2021 and 2022, but we will be paying off about $35 million. And so by the end of 22, by the end of council's term, a balance of about $485 million. And you can see that here on the slide. That does include Utilities Kingston debt. And so we have split it out here between Utilities Kingston, our tax supported debt, and some debt, particularly in recreation, where it's covered by user charges as well. So you can see that on this slide. The one thing I think I did mention to council previously, but I think certainly worth repeating, particularly because I've been doing this for the 13 or 14 years I've been here in terms of this debt strategy. We definitely, council reached a milestone, I think, in 2020 on our debt, because this is really the first time that we can take that debt that's been approved but not yet issued and break it down in the projects. And perhaps if I can go to the next slide. You'll see the 136 million that's yet to be issued. More than half of that does relate to the Cataraqui Bay wastewater plant, 78 million. And then you'll see some of the other projects that are there. The reason we've really reached a milestone here is, except maybe, and you might argue we would pull out the 6.3 of roads, these are all projects that are not asset replacement and renewal investments. They are new projects. They're significant projects where it would make sense to be issuing debt on them. But anything in terms of our asset replacement and renewal investments, we are now paying as a pay-as-you-go. I will leave a caveat that I expect in another couple of years, as we start to increase our annual investment that we should be making in roads, we may have to use a bit of debt on that, and I would call that asset management. We may need to use a bit of debt as we try to get those levels up to where they should be based on some of our life cycle analysis. But I really think at this point, up until now, if I had showed this list, there still would have been a lot of asset management costs on there. So I think that's certainly illustrative of the some of the strategies that we've been working on over the last few years, and certainly turned a corner. And then finally, just on the debt, in terms of our strategies, so just to remind council, we did affirm the AA rating with stable outlook with Standard & Poor's late last fall. We really weren't sure what the pandemic and some of our financial implications of that was going to mean. So we were quite happy to be able to hold that rating. And certainly going forward in terms of our strategies, we continue to monitor particularly interest rates. And the timing of when we want to issue some of that $136 million in terms of taking advantage. So we are watching those very closely, as well as some of our cash flow models. And we continue to watch, and the departments work with us in terms of the timing of the projects, the level of capital spending, and the timing of our debt issuance, because those are all measures that Standard & Poor's looks at in terms of our rating. And so we continue to monitor those to make sure that we're not going offside with those. Next slide, please. Sorry, I forgot to tell you one more, please. So council's familiar with this debt level forecast, but I couldn't not put it in one more time in the budget presentation. So you can see the red line is our provincial level in terms of our debt repayment limit that they set each year for us. The green line is the council approved level of debt, which certainly is a more realistic level of maximum level with respect to our budgets, our level of debt, our cash flow, and our ability to repay. And you can see then our blue lines, which is our projected debt. This is not based on approvals, times of approvals. This is based on timing around when we project the money to be spent and when we project to actually issue the long-term debt on those completed projects. And you can see, and I believe last year we had maybe 1 or 2 years where we were just at the green line. This year we are easily below the green line each year. The reason for that, our numbers basically have shifted out a year. Things did slow down for 2020. And I guess the benefit of that is as things shift out, that green line goes up. We were able to even stay down even farther below that green line. So certainly that's been maybe one of few positive things that's happened in 2020 with respect to the pandemic and some of that timing. And a couple more slides, we can move on. So I just thought, so you don't have to listen to me again, I'm just going to quickly cover off some of the corporate revenues and expenditures and the financial services department presentation. So in terms of some of the corporate, our capital levy and our fiscal services and tax adjustments, which on that great big summary spreadsheet on page 7 of your binder is down near the bottom. Excuse me, the capital levy and fiscal services, you can see is up about 2.3 million or 5.7%. That is our 1% for the capital levy is within that category, and so that's most of what's driving that. We are cumulative now at about almost $44 million of capital levy each year that's coming in. Also within that category is I mentioned that our investment income, we have reduced it from $1.5 million to about $1 million. The Safe Restart funding, the $1.4 million for 2021, we've left that in a corporate account rather than trying to allocate it out to departments. So that would be within this category. I did mention that we did not make the transfer to the working fund reserve for the provincial funding amount that we were collecting from the education room because we were using that to help offset the PIL reduction. So that would not be showing in 2021, and it was a transfer in 2020. And then also in the tax assistance adjustments and allowances category, which is down about $200,000, council will recall they approved 2 years ago for us to phase out the vacancy rebate program. We phased it out over 2 years. 450 down in 2020, and the second 450,000 now is out of the 2021 budget, and so that is driving the change in the tax assistance and allowance numbers. Within that last category, in terms of tax adjustments, that is where we have things like our allowance for tax write-offs, which has held, we left it consistent at about $2 million. It actually is a higher level. We put it up in 20 and we left it up in 2021 because we are still having to deal with some prior year reassessments that MPAC is working on, particularly some of the large retail properties, the big box stores, and more recently the Cataraqui Town Center has an appeal in. And so we are still trying to deal with some of those to try to get those to the right level and anticipate we will still have a couple more write-offs in 2021. I'm hoping by 2022, and in our projection, we have actually lowered our allowance for tax write-offs. This category also includes our DC impost exemptions that we do on our industrial properties, as well as our brownfields community improvement plan program. We do have about an increase of about $500,000 in our brownfields, and that will continue to increase in our projections. By 2024, we have about $3.1 million in brownfield costs, as some of these brownfield properties are coming online, and we're having to pay back the brownfields out of the incremental taxes. So you will see that going up in the projections. Next slide. So finally, in terms of financial services, and I've got mayor and council in here as well. So financial services is going down by about $113,000. We have reduced actually a position that we had temporarily, and we had turned it last year into a permanent supervisor position. And we're now revisiting that, and we've actually pulled that back out of the budget at this point in terms of our salary costs. In terms of financial services, in terms of priorities and what they'll be looking at in 2021 and into 2022, we had a couple of main technology projects that were actually on our work plan in 2020 that got deferred because of the pandemic and other work priorities that created. We do still need to do an upgrade to a cloud-based version of our financial management system. It's a fairly significant upgrade. We have deferred it to 2021. It has to happen in 2021 and early 2022 because we will start to see our support reducing by the end of, I think, by mid 2022. So we do need to do this, as well as our new corporate point of sale solution. So our cashier systems is also getting out of date, and we do have some risk of losing the support on that in the future, though they have recently extended it for us. So we were able to defer some of that work, but again, that will have to take place in 2021. So the department will be very busy with both those technology projects. In our procurement area, we have an updated procurement bylaw that needs to come back to council and to administrative policies, and we're continuing to work on that. We also are working on some coordinated purchasing opportunities, streamlining some of our purchasing practices to determine where there are potential savings with respect to how we are doing some of our procurement. We've continue to implement and expand our budget engagement work plan. It certainly took a lot more resources than we anticipated in 2020. And so we are expecting probably something similar in 2021. And so that is definitely going to use up some of our resources in 2021 as we start to expand that in terms of what we can do for the 2022 budget engagement. And then finally, continual risk management plans, focusing on some of our effectiveness and compliance with some of our corporate financial policies and procedures. And I believe we are looking at some of our accounts receivable and cash receipts procedures in the next year. And then finally, you see Mayor and Council has contributed to our helping us with our budget challenges. They're down almost 2%. Besides freezing the 2021 council remuneration, we also did do a reduction of about 50% of the council travel costs for 2021. And then we have put that back out in the projections. And next slide, I think, Mr. Mayor, I think I am done.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ms. Kennedy, you can take a breath now.
Thank you.
An hour and a half later. Very good. So at this point, I will open up the floor to questions from council. Councillor Bowe.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you and Madam Treasurer for that very detailed overview of the city budget. I just had some quick questions in regards to, and they're very high level, I hope. The transit stream that you discussed in one of your, I believe it was one of your initial slides, I think the number escapes, I think it was around 10.8 million. And you indicated that we would not be able to maximize that. Was that for transit expansion or capital? Because typically those grants don't affect operating costs. Is that correct?
Yes, so those grants were under the Safe Restart monies, and so they were strictly for operating, not for capital.
Oh, so they were for operating. Okay.
Yes, yep. So loss of revenues primarily. So pandemic-related impacts to the transit operating budget.
Okay, and so just quickly, so we can't maximize them just simply because we did reduce a lot of those services. Is that the idea there?
Yeah, the reason we can't maximize them is they literally just gave us too much money.
Okay.
And I think part of it was we don't know what the formula was in terms of how they got to the 10.6 million. It was much more than what we thought we would get based on our application process. I think if we were a municipality, perhaps if we had kept our transit going at 100% and drove the buses around with no people on them, we might have been able to use the 10.6 million. And I think there were a couple of municipalities that didn't maybe it wasn't 100%, but didn't reduce their service levels a lot. But we don't know what the formula was. So it just, at this point, we just don't anticipate that by March 31st, because we can only do it up to the impact up to March 31st of 2021, that we would be able to use all of it.
Thank you for that. And just a quick question. I know it comes up pretty much this time every year, or budget time at least. As far as the heads and beds taxes and what we kind of receive payment in lieu of, has there been any movement on that? Because it's now been, I'm sure you wouldn't. How many years has it been since that has actually been increased for municipalities?
I'm guessing. I'm trying to recall what it was. Like, it's probably 25 years, something like that, at least. And yeah, no movement, no discussion at all. It's still sitting at $75.
So that's
I
something
think,
maybe.
I think it was 1987. I think it's been frozen since then.
Okay, so for anybody watching, that's maybe something to indicate to the other levels of government. That'd be great if that could go up at some point, seeing as it's been, 30 some years. And my final question is on the 1% capital levy. I understand the value of this, and I believe the community does as well. I know that many municipalities that don't have a 1% capital levy are very envious of the fact that Kingston does. Is this something that is ever designed to sort of fall off or reduce in time? And if so, when would that occur? Because when we try to indicate to residents we're only increasing at 1.4%, but then there's a 1% capital levy, the way that really comes across, I guess, at the end of the day to the person receiving it on the end is they see it as just a 2.4% tax increase. So is there a way, I understand we break it down, but to the person paying the bill at the end of the day, it's 2.4%.
Yes. So thank you, Councillor Bohm. That's a good question. And I meant to mention that. So we have in our models, we've modeled it, I believe, for another 5 or 6 years. And then we've started to bring it down after that. I would say that the one thing that I think, we'll revisit that in terms of our models, and we've done that probably for about 3 years now in the models that way, that we will revisit is as we get some of this asset management work done, it's going to help to inform what should we be investing, what's our sustainable level of investment in our capital assets. And so I think that will get us a better idea of what we should be investing. So, roads is a great example. We're investing, we've been down because we've done a lot of new projects in roads the last few years, but we were up around maybe 15 million a year. I remember when not long after I started, I remember our director of engineering telling me we should be spending 30. I would guess now we probably should be spending 40 or 45. So it's a bit of a hit and miss. Our models in our capital plan show us trying to get up to that. So I think as we get some of this better asset management information, we really can start to nail down what is that sustainable level and how do we get there. And then the 1% will be part of that. And so we can revisit that. But I can tell you right now, I think it's about 5 years out that we started to wean us off of it a bit and see what that did to our models. And based on what we have today, that looked like it was certainly reasonable.
That's great news, because I know that there's always pressure on the political side of things to get down to some form of cost of living increases. That's how people kind of build their budgets. So hearing that that's going to basically be remodeled based on asset management plan and possibly go down in time is a great news story. Thank you.
Okay, next is Deputy Mayor Ostroff.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. The question I have is related to your page on excuse me, on debt. And maybe we've been told this before and I just don't recall, but when you list the $78 million related to waste management, why is that part of our budget? Why would that not have shown in the Utilities Kingston presentation? Why is that listed for us?
So thank you. Yes, thank you, Councillor. That's a good question. So the city issues debt on behalf of Utilities Kingston because those assets are actually owned by the city. So we're the legal owner.
Not a taxpayer issue, but not a tax burden.
No, yes, very good point. They're not a tax burden. So the slide where I showed the percentage of tax payments that was coming off and the projected debt, utilities counts for about 41% of our debt overall, and that 41% would be paid by utility rates, not tax
Yeah.
rates. Yep.
I think it's a very important for the public listening to understand that too, and puts a perspective on it. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Excellent report.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Councillor Neal.
Thank you. And thank you for your presentation. Quick question, that wonderful green line chart that we see every year, I like to call it the limbo line. We're always trying to get under that green line. You brought up a very important point in your discussion with Councillor Bohm. Clearly, and I saw a lot of nods going on, our roads can use more capital in order to do asset management and maintain them. And it's something every councillor hears every year. I'm wondering, with some council direction, do we have enough wiggle room under that green line to be able to do a more aggressive asset management for our road system? And do we have the capacity internally to be able to do that without having to contract it all out?
So yes, thank you, Councillor Neal. So I was just going to say, I think part of that question would be a good one to answer when our Commissioner of Transportation is speaking with respect to capacity, because I would question whether we do. And I think, the other piece, as I said, I think once we can get some of this asset management work done, that will help to inform that as well. So, if we need to do it quicker and we have the capacity, there is a little bit of capacity there below the line, absolutely. We do have a little bit of debt built in, as you saw. We start to come back down, and we're significantly below the line in the out years, and we do still have some debt issued along within those years as well. But I think it's going to soon be time to kind of do a recheck on that when we get some of that asset management, and I think we'll be able to answer that question much better at that point. And I see Commissioner Kidd can weigh in here for us.
Thank you.
Do you want to weigh in now, or did you want to address it? I know your first up is the presenters for the departments, but whatever you'd prefer.
Just very quickly, I can just respond that we would not have the capacity at this point to be able to take that on, considering we have all of the capital projects that are funded under ISIP and DMAF. We always struggle with the length of the construction season that we're working with. And I do think, as the treasurer said, we absolutely need to get the asset management plan done. And that plan, the very first core asset plan under the Ontario regulations, is coming to council for July 1st of this year.
It may be one of those rare times where I say maybe we do need to do a little bit of contracting out, because our roads really do need to be addressed. My final question, and it was just brought up, the asset management, that's reflected within that forecast expenditure of capital as we see it go up year after year. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct, Councillor. You are correct. Yes, it's in there. And it does actually show increased investment for some of the areas like roads and facilities.
Super. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks for your presentation. It's very informative. It's one thing reading it, it's another actually hearing it, and you absorb so much better when you hear it and have somebody present it. So thanks for that. I had similar conversations with residents like Councillor Bohm was just describing. And considering the challenge that we're in, I just wonder if you can explain the importance of that 1% capital levy and why we couldn't perhaps change it to 0.5% just for this year, or even not charge that one extra percent, why it really is so important.
Thank you, Councillor Doherty. So it's definitely part of an overall capital funding strategy. I would say, just as a prelude, we are certainly in an enviable position of a number of municipalities, in that we've had this 1%, and that we are very slowly now getting to a point where, because of that, we've got the money before we're actually spending those asset management dollars. And what happens to a lot of other municipalities where they don't have that type of strategy is they deal with the variances within their operating budget, because they don't have that set aside, and then something comes up and they've got to find that money. And so it does create volatility even within the operating budget in trying to manage that. So I think, having that long-term vision that folks long before me had in terms of setting up some of this strategy is certainly the envy, I think, of a lot of municipalities. So part of that has been, as you know, since amalgamation, part of that strategy was to catch up on some of the investment in capital assets. The city had been behind in terms of its investment in early years prior to amalgamation, and the two townships as well. And so there was a strategy to use debt to catch us up. And increase those debt levels in order to get us to that level where we've, at least to a level we felt we would sort of be where we were safe to be, knowing we still have a ways to go yet. And so part of that is issuing the debt. That 1%, a component of that goes towards the debt charges. So that's the first piece, is if we stopped that 1%, or we did half of it now rather than sort of out where we've projected, it means a greater percentage of our capital funds is going to go to debt as opposed to pay as you go. And it's going to start us going backwards again, where we're going to be back maybe issuing more debt because we won't have the pay as you go funds, because we're locked into the debt. There's nothing we can do on that piece. And then that's the other piece of it, I think, is that pay as you go piece. So either we issue debt or we have to stop some of our investment. So that would be the other way around it, is we don't do the 1%, or we only do 0.5%. We have to continue with our debt payments. So that means that we have to reduce our capital payments, our capital plans. And so that's going to put us farther behind on the asset management. And I say farther behind on the asset management because I think if you look back over, even the last 10 to 12 years, there has been a focus with the City of Kingston on growth and new assets. So, we built arenas, and we're building community centers, and we built the Leon Center, and we're building bridges and all those kinds of things, which is good. But that focus was on that. There was less investment then in the asset management. And so, and I'm kind of predicting what's going to come out of some of the asset management work is, I think there'll be a swing maybe to more investment in the asset management piece, and maybe a little less in some of the new assets. And so if we were to sort of step off that trail that we've got with respect to the 1%, that's what's going to get hurt then now, as we sort of start to focus on that as the asset management. And I think that'll leave the gap. So the end is near, absolutely, I think. And I know it's been a challenge for taxpayers. But I think just the position we are in today is such greater benefit than a lot of municipalities, because the folks that had the senior management teams that had this foresight back at amalgamation to put this into place.
Thanks. That was really informative. But I just want to check to that. You're saying that deferring it or not charging it this year isn't just as simple as saying it'll take us 6 years instead of 5 years. It'll actually cost us more money.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, it does accumulate in the models, and we've tried that. We've tried pulling it out a bit to see what it does. And I know if we pulled even 0.5% out now, it wouldn't be another 0.5% 6 years from now. It'd probably be at least another percent, or another year, 1%, something like that. So yeah, it definitely accumulates. Those funds, we have about, I think maybe 200 million, something like 180 million in our capital reserve funds. So those monies are also earning interest, which is a big component as well. That's going back into those capital reserve funds. So as we start to draw down those balances, if we weren't putting that in, we'd also be a bit of a double whammy, because we wouldn't have the interest income as well going in there.
Okay, Excellent. Thanks for that. So I have a couple other shorter questions. The 2.5 assessment growth for the development charges. There were some provincial changes to development charges, and that developers could perhaps pay in phases for the development charge. And I previously asked about how that will affect cash flow. So I wonder if you have some more information about that.
I don't have information, Councillor. I can certainly provide that. I can say I believe we've had a couple now that are doing the payment. There has not been a lot, certainly throughout 2020 as things slow down a little bit. I don't think there's been a whole lot that's applied to do that. So it has not been an issue for us from a cash flow standpoint. And I don't see it based on kind of what we are anticipating in some of our models. I don't see it to be a big problem on the cash flow. But time will tell for sure. But yeah, I would say we've maybe had a couple, but I don't think we've had any more of that at this point.
Okay, thanks. And just one final question, and that's when you discussed wages and benefits, where does the summer student program fit? And that was really affected this in 2020, and hopefully we can bring it back in 2021. But where in the budget do we see that? Is that like in different budgets, like cultural services and arts and rec kind of thing?
Yes, it is. It's within the departments. I believe there is some budget in 2021 for summer students. I think we were anticipating some of that would definitely come back, but yeah, it would be throughout the departments.
Okay. Excellent, thanks.
Hey, thank you. Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple of questions, a couple of technical ones, just for clarification. The on page 23 of 41, you're talking about federal government funding and the loss of housing subsidy transfers. It says the housing loss in this funding is offset by an additional 341,000 K in federal gas fund tax funding. And I was just wondering how federal gas money offsets since they really don't generally belong in the same category. Like, I mean, we're going to get the gas money anyway, so it just seems to me a straight loss.
So, Councillor, that reference on page 23, that is addressing the variance in the total federal government funding. So that includes the housing funding, which is reducing, but that reduction has been offset by the federal gas tax. So it's all within that revenue category.
Okay. I see. Okay, fair enough. Thanks. I misread it. And then right below that, it talks about the reduction, the budget revenues indicate recoveries for $72,000 in local housing corporation, nonprofit housing provider recoveries from the county of Frontenac. Why is that? Why are those recoveries forthcoming?
Recoveries from county of Frontenac. That may be a question that we want to ask CAO when she presents that budget in terms of what that specific reduction is. I know it is based on specific properties that are in the county. So it's not just a flat percentage. It is actually based on that. And I believe it may have something to do with some of the work that's done in those, but I think I better leave that for the CAO to respond when she's presenting that department budget.
Okay. Finally, on page 39 and 41, there's a question about transit. I'm going to skip that and bring it up later maybe. But in general, you're talking about budget projections have assumed that we will be back to typical service levels by 2024. I'm wondering what the reasoning is behind that. And we have now maybe it was written before the vaccines were rolling out, but and I can't tell that from that statement. So just wondering why, like that's 3 years from now. What is staff's thinking on this? That it's going to take that long?
Yep. So there will be more information provided by the commissioners on this, but some of the services are sort of back to the pre-COVID levels well before 2024. I believe it's transit that actually stretches out that long, because there is some unknown with transit around what that new level of service or new level of demand is going to be in the future. So are people going to be working from home more and not using transit? Like we just don't know what transit's going to look like. So I believe that's one that does stretch out to late 23 and into 2024 before we're actually back to those revenue levels that we would have had in budgeted in 2020. Some of the other services like recreation and culture are transitioned back quite quickly. Like I think some of them are even transitioned back by end of 21, early 2022. So that will be covered by the commissioner departments, but that's why we sort of said, because 24 is our final projection, there is still a little bit of transition back in 2024, particularly for transit.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, next on my list is Councillor Sanik.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you. And thank you so much, CFO Kennedy, for providing us with this information. Whenever you present to council, your information is always so clear and much easier to understand. So thank you. That goes all the way back to 2007 when you were explaining the Kingston Center or the Leon Center to us. So thank you always for your info. I really liked the chart on page 38 of 41, table 4, showing the average residential tax bill changes. If we could keep that in all the future years, very helpful to whoever's on council at that time. I know this chart showing the last 10 years, if we even went back, the last 15 years, you could see how the tax rate has come down even further back from like 2007, 2008, when sometimes it was 5%, 4%, and now we're back down in the 2% range. So thank you for providing that. And thank you also for the slide you showed of how our comparator cities have done their tax rates to Kingston. That's really helpful to us to know, like if we're out of line or if we're in line. Very helpful information. I have a question about the community engagement. So we know that there's all the comments are in this budget document. For the people that submitted the comments, right? The 239 people, whatever number that was, will those comments, like the compilation of the comments, be sent back to them? Because they all had to do the survey by signing in, right? They have an account. That means they have an email address. All the comments were helpful to us as counselors. I just don't know if the general public will, like look up our budget document we have tonight that's posted and then, look within it to where all the comments are there. Like it would just be helpful, I think, to all the residents in Kingston, and especially the ones that had the comments, if it's possible to send the comments back to them, like just this document, send it back to the ones and then somehow publish it on the city website, just the comment, like just that section of engagement, and then maybe with a heading saying, hey, like this was the engagement from the budget. Next year, we want even more people, look what these people said. Next year, maybe, like have your say too. Going back to the fall, it was a busy time. There's the American election as well as all the COVID things. So I think the comments that we received, is a pretty good, was a pretty good turnout considering just how busy it was in the fall time. So I just wondered if maybe that's what could happen going forward.
Thanks, Councillor. I think that's a great idea. I do know there's been some communications out and some of our social media. Our communications officer has been putting that information out about, check this report for the feedback from and how it's impacted our budget. But I think that's a good point. We could put it on our Get Involved Kingston page. And I think that's an excellent point. We could use it to kind of springboard off into the next phase of the budget engagement. So I'll definitely talk to communications about that and see how we can do that and make sure people are aware. You're right, we do have the email, and so I think we've got the ability to do that too. So I will look into that to make sure we're doing that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, next, Councillor Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can you hear me? Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so yes, just following up on the engagement piece, and Councillor Sanik asked exactly one of my questions, word for word. And the other question I had on that was, well, I guess two more questions. So one, I do know that it's challenging developing surveys and asking for self-identification, but was curious if there was a means for individuals who were signing on to the survey and providing responses to indicate if they're a member of marginalized groups.
Thank you, Councillor. I believe in the exhibit, there is some information on the groups, but I don't think we asked that specifically. I think it was more about situation around whether you were homeowner, property owner, tenant, that kind of thing. I don't think it was anything in terms of whether they were a marginalized group at all. And I think, to that point, we did get some feedback around how do we expand our engagement to ensure that we are getting getting everybody having that opportunity, different groups to be involved. That was a bit of a challenge for sure through COVID, but it's certainly something we've been talking about going forward.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. And then the other question was, I mean, given that you've referenced that and previously some of the other challenges just with getting participation in this process, I was wondering, and I know there was a motion at some point along the way, but if there will be eventually a report to council on recommendations on how to improve the engagement process? Or is that something, like, will we hear about that again between now and the next budget?
So we could do that. So we have the report that we brought that outlined the engagement process last year that council approved was actually a 3-year plan. At that point, we picked some elements for year 1. We're trying to expand for year 2. And I believe by year 3 is when we're actually starting to sort of dip our toe in the water around participatory budgeting by year 3. So I didn't have a plan to bring that back, but I think certainly we could do that, either bring it back as a report or bring in information back to council on what our 2022 budget engagement looks like. We're just working on that now. We would like to launch that fairly early this year. We definitely felt we were up against timelines. It was just too tight. So the plan is to launch it much earlier, like not too long after this budget's approved. So that's something for sure we can make sure we get that communicated back, what that plan looks like to council.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? Councillor Chappelle.
Thank you, through Chair. That's great. I'm glad some of my colleagues mentioned a number of the cities that were being referenced for taxation ranges, and I'm wondering why Belleville wasn't mentioned.
Thank you, Councillor. So I didn't put Belleville on because we were trying to get a hold of somebody from Belleville today. So my understanding is Belleville has not approved their 2021 budget. They approved their 2020 budget very late in 2020, like I think it was July or August. And so they actually included some pandemic issues in there. We did pull the Belleville documents that we could find off the website. And to be completely honest, I cannot see the 0%. I've looked at their budget. I've looked at their tax revenue. it looks like it goes up about 3%. I may not be looking at the right thing, and unfortunately, we just couldn't get a hold of anybody today to clarify that. So it looks like it's 2020. I will stay on it, Councillor, and I will give the CFO there a call the next day or two and see if I can get a hold of her just to find out. But certainly, based on I looked at it, my tax manager was taking a look for me this morning, and we couldn't find it. I found the newspaper article, but that was all I could find.
And the newspaper article does confirm 0%. And I was speaking with Councillor Ryan Williams there on just earlier today, actually myself, and they're looking at targeting a 0% increase. So 0%, well, no increase, 0%. So Belleville would be a good city to use, and maybe we can ask them how they manage that because they also have some infrastructure projects. I think of $100 million in debt for their downtown redevelopment. With regards to all of the public consultation that came forward, I guess participation from the community, and there was a number of items that were mentioned on they like to see reductions or increases. I didn't hear you explain to council how you accounted for their input on the budget.
So I didn't go over that today, Councillor, because I thought my 30-minute presentation, which took like over an hour, I was trying to keep it as short as I could, and that information is actually in the report. So the way we structured the budget engagement piece in the council report, it was a reporting back to council and to the public. So you'll see what we did. We tried to, again, find those commonality areas within the feedback. And then there's a staff commentary within each one that says, here's how this has impacted the budget. So, and it gives some examples of where this feedback can be seen within the budget. So that is within the report, and that's why I didn't do it as part of the presentation as well.
With regards to the updated procurement bylaw, that's the bylaw that's going to ask for an increase in delegated authority from $50,000 to $100,000.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. And with regards to, there's a comment about operational fund shortfalls. And this is where the extra money from the working fund reserve. So the working fund reserve is contributed by that 1% that we were taxing on people for capital funding. But then I noticed the operational working fund reserves seems to fall throughout the course of the budget items in the different agencies, especially in housing. There's an envelope of money that comes from the working fund reserves. So even though we tell the public we're collecting 1% for capital, that money is not always specifically used just for capital. Is that a correct assumption or is that incorrect? I'm really confused because either we should change the name, the differential, or do we use capital fund reserves for operating expenses?
So you're right, Councillor, we should change the name. It is very confusing. So the 1% is completely for capital. It is not used for operating. It does not go into the working fund reserve. The working fund reserve has our operating surpluses goes in. That's the main item that goes into our working fund reserve each year and tries to keep it up at that level. So they're completely separate. We don't mix those two at all. With the 1% goes into our capital reserve funds, and then our working fund reserve is for operating only.
Thank you for clarifying that because it was a and I'll leave it at that for now. I obviously always have more questions. I appreciate our debt reduction plan and putting $30 million against that credit card, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Stroh.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. And I may need to ask this to one of the commissioners, I guess, but I'll get to the point of what I'm after. There's an ongoing issue with administrative support amongst councillors in the sense that we're administered by the clerk's office, but we don't have an administrative support of our own. So to begin to frame that question, could you just confirm administrative assistance at the City of Kingston? Is it correct that the following employees all have the benefit of an administrative assistant? The mayor, the CAO, the treasurer, each commissioner, and some other senior management. Is that correct?
So, Councillor, I will have to leave some of that detail to the departments to cover off. But what I can say is that one of the things that we've been doing, and where we found some of the cost savings actually, is there are executive assistants at the to support the commissioner level, and there are administrative assistants that support the director's level, but they are not one-on-one. So what I can speak to that I know personally, so I do not have an executive assistant. My deputy treasurer's administrative assistant actually reports to both of us. So she has basically administrative assistant, but that person also supports me through my office. And I would say more recently, we have started to look at some of the administrative assistants, and you will hear from a couple of the commissioners tonight where they are now going to be sharing an administrative assistant. So it's not a one-to-one, but that's kind of the level of what we've got for support.
Well, thank you for mentioning that, because that sort of leads into my next question. It has been suggested in the past that council could share administrative assistant or two amongst the 12 of us, or whatever the ratio might want to be. It would be less than 1-to-1. I know all about ratios in my other job as a nurse. Depending on what level of care you're in, you get either a whole nurse to yourself if you're a really sick person in intensive care, or you get half a nurse, or a quarter of a nurse, or a sixth of a nurse, or an eighth of a nurse, depending on what level of care you're in. And in long-term care, it gets kind of scary how thin it gets spread. But here at council, we get zero administrative assistants. So the question would be, for budget purposes, what kind of, would it be a major impact on the departmental budget if we either redeployed some administrative assistants to cover councillors as well, or if we had one to share amongst the 12 of us? What would that do to our budget?
So I may defer some of this to our Commissioner of Corporate Services when he's speaking in terms of that. I mean, it would add a salary plus benefits, plus probably some ancillary costs to it to have someone. I would suggest, and again, I'll leave this with the commissioner to comment, but I would suggest it might be something that we'd want to take away and see what we could do. Look at our existing staffing, and do we have any capacity at the administrative level there, and what a solution might be based on what council thinks that they need. And I think we'd have to get a handle on what council feels that they need in terms of support and the level that they would need. And then we could certainly go from there on how we could actually fill that gap.
Yes, like I say, we have zero support at the moment, and unless you count the committee clerk that I sometimes benefit from, being the chair of several committees. The committee clerks have been very helpful with administrative support on an on-demand basis, not every day, obviously, but it's always been in the back of my mind that I don't understand why in other municipalities councillors have their own administrative or executive assistants, each one, or they share them 1-to-2, and we don't have any at all. And it has always been an obvious discrepancy for me. And so we talk about these large budgets with all the employees that the city has, and we can't even pay one person to give administrative support to 12 part-time city councillors. If we were paid a full-time salary, then you could argue we should be our own administrative assistant, because we would have the time to do that. But we all work other jobs, those of us that are working age. And this is a definite need that I have, and I know other councillors have mentioned this, and I haven't heard tonight or any other night a credible reason why we continue to have zero support. So I would look forward to that discussion in the future. There are, dozens of administrative assistants at the City of Kingston, but none of them for the benefit of councillors. And I just wanted to make that point tonight, because tonight would be an opportunity for us to rectify that. I wanted to know what that looked like, but we'll have to wait till the commissioner comes up.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from council? Okay, so it is 8:04. So we will take a 10-minute break, and then we will reconvene with our first department presentation at 8:14. See you in 10 minutes. Okay, folks, it's 8:15, so we will reconvene. Okay, so our next presentation is a Transportation and Public Works Services. And so we will hand the floor over to Commissioner Sheila Kidd to take us through that.
Okay, thank you, Mayor and Council, for the opportunity to present the budget for Transportation and Public Works. I'll take a brief pause and say, leave it to me to add levity to the budget process. I suggest you don't play with the settings in Zoom, or you'll end up with the lips that I had, like the Tasmanian devil when I was on camera a few minutes ago. You got to humor yourself.
I wasn't going to say anything, Commissioner Kidd. So.
And I couldn't let it go. Thank you. Anyway, hopefully we got a chuckle out of it. At least I didn't go for a mustache or anything. So Transportation and Public Works, the team of directors are also available to answer any questions that council may have. And so we'll see if we can make a little bit of time up here. If we could change the slide, please. And again. Okay, so the group is made up of 6 departments. They're all listed down the side. The gross expenditures for Transportation and Public Works is about 81.4 million. We have revenues of about 25.6. So the net budget for the 6 groups is $55.5 million. For 2021, that is an increase of about 2 million or 4% over the 2020 budget. One thing that I would point out is that the corporate asset management and fleet line is zeroed out, and that is because all of the charges then are charged out to the operating departments. So the costs for fleet services are captured within the operating groups. Next slide, please. In terms of capital, as Ms. Kennedy has already pointed out, we have a pretty lean capital budget this year, particularly for Transportation and Public Works. Primary reason for that for us is because Transportation and Engineering received approval for multi-year budgets last year for all of the infrastructure. And the remaining groups were very cautious, again, because we had capital works that we couldn't necessarily get to or get as far completed on as we wanted to with COVID delays. So we've asked for as small a capital budget as possible. And the total for all 6 departments then is coming in at 13.2. Next slide. For transportation services, the variance to 2020 is about $333,000. The key initiatives that will be implemented through this budget over the course of 21 and probably into 22 are a number of priorities of council. So the implementation of the red light camera automated enforcement program. This is a program that council directed us to research and explore. And so we will have a report coming forward shortly on this, I believe the March timeline. And we'll be advancing this program, and implementation is expected to occur in the 2022 timeline. We also have a motion to review and report back on automated speed enforcement. The difference between red light camera and automated speed is the automated speed is more like the speed radar. And again, this is a report that will be coming to council by Q2 of this year. These reports will primarily come through the EIT committee. We will be completing the update of the traffic calming and pedestrian crossing policies. These policies have been a topic of discussion at council for several years in terms of what we can accomplish in reducing speeds and particularly making neighborhoods feel safer. And so we brought a report to committee just recently. There will be another update report that is coming to February EIT, and then by April of this year, we will actually have recommendations with regard to policy updates on that. We pedestrian crossings as well. We have some funding that we have been now awarded through the ISIP grant funding. So we have new pedestrian crossing locations to recommend and explore, and school crossings as well. This budget does include an increase in crossing guards so that we can support the objective to create safer school zones and the Safe to School program. So we have 3 locations where we'll be adding school crossing guards this year. And I can very quickly, they are St. Martha at Jasmine, Development at Trudell, and Birchwood at Brackenwood. We also have a couple of other staff positions that we've added. And again, this is to be able to support some of the policy and program work around active transportation, traffic calming, all of the other pieces of council's strategic priority around roads and walking and neighborhood plans. So those have been built into the budget this year. In addition to that, we will be doing a review of the patio bylaw. You'll also see this come up again in Public Works. So due to COVID, we have been creative. We were creative last year and we plan to be again this year in terms of how we can use and provide more patio space to the business operators in the downtown core and the BIA area. And so we've also recognized that there are more things that we can do and that this is something that we should be considering perhaps on a more permanent basis. So we're going to step back from it a little bit over the course of this year and also take some time to study it and see how we can identify some enhancements for those types of services. And last but not least, just hiring the staff and getting them in place is going to take us still a bit of, we did deferrals last year to be able to hold our expenses down, but we are moving forward with those position postings now. And again, with all the work that's in the strategic plan and the transportation work plans, in addition to supporting the planning department studies that are occurring and the transportation studies that support that. The primary COVID-19 impact for this department is in the parking revenues. So the parking department is also a part of transportation services. As Ms. Kennedy indicated, we did reduce the parking revenues. We're not sure what to expect from 2021. It's very difficult. For certain, we reduced like event parking revenues and anything associated with events at the Leon Center. We've reduced our permit revenues a little bit. And so because parking is a cost center though, if our estimates are off for our revenues, it will ultimately just mean that we may be transferring less into the parking reserve fund at the end of the year. So it won't have an impact on the tax base. Next slide, please. Engineering services. Actually is going down slightly, and that's just discretionary spending and reductions and a little bit more revenue projections. So overall, pretty much holding its own. So the work for engineering over the course of 21 and the upcoming years will be basically plan, design, and manage our road and sidewalk rehabilitation programs. We've talked a lot about asset management already. And we, as I indicated, we will be presenting an asset management plan for the core assets. That's roads, bridges for us and stormwater. And that will come to council in time to meet the deadline for July 2021. We are planning on increasing our bridge inspections this year. The work of the team is very much focused around contract and construction management for roads, stormwater, shoreline projects. And again, we talked about the capital funding that we've received through the DMAF fund and the ISIP program. So some very significant capital grant money that's been provided to us. And we're getting ourselves ready to get those projects defined and get them out on the street so that we can take as much advantage as we can of the potential for funding from the federal and provincial government. And then the last piece for engineering services includes the design and construction of parks and open spaces. Next slide, please. Even though we're not asking for capital budget, I thought the budget presentation might seem a bit incomplete if we didn't at least mention it. So we have, when we show the works in progress for capital for the departments, that refers to capital dollars that have already been approved in previous years. Ours will be significant because the pre-approval for transportation and engineering for 21 and 22 are now showing in WIP. But, and that is all of the infrastructure work that is planned for all of the services listed: sidewalks, pedestrian crossings, roads, shorelines, parks, stormwater. So for anyone who's interested, just to find an easy place to understand what's planned and the scope of that, I've provided the link to the My Neighborhood app on the city's website. And I've also provided some additional details in the budget overview documents. Next slide, please. So Public Works is an increase this year of 3.62%. About 74% of the budgets for the whole departments in transportation and public works is salaries and wages. We have a significant workforce, and so some of the variance and a significant portion of this variance is just inflationary increases for our workers, but also a few minor changes and costs for materials and certainly a slight increase for insurance, again, as the treasurer mentioned. So those types of inflationary increases really hitting the budget. The work that Public Works will do with these operating funds, always the day-to-day operations for all roads, sidewalks, forestry, parks, sports fields, trails, continuing to focus on improving year-round maintenance for any infrastructure related to active transportation, so sidewalks, bus stops, and cycling lanes. We will be developing a multi-year operating plan for the forestry, and that's a commitment that we made. We presented a report to EIT in the last couple of months, and the operating plan that will be developed over 2021 will help to define how we will achieve the double the tree canopy objectives and what's involved in that. Last year, we were asked to implement a wildflower pilot project, and that project was planned and ready to go, but it was deferred for implementation because of COVID. So we'll be picking that up in the spring and moving forward with the implementation. Also launching what we're calling a litter awareness program. We've had a lot of feedback and a lot of members of the public who have commented on just litter that is that is around the streets and in parks and things like that. And so Public Works is working with our communications team to develop a litter awareness program, and it'll have some elements that will allow for members of the public to participate in litter cleanup. So we can bring an information report to provide more details, but we think it's an important aspect of keeping the city clean and neighborhoods and parks in particular. We will continue to research and implement technology so that we can improve our processes and automate some of our data collections. And in terms of a COVID-19 impact, we did reduce the revenue for sports fields that we normally get to 75% for the 2021 budget. And again, we are not sure whether that's an accurate amount, but we felt that hopefully it's reflective of the level of service that we'll be able to provide and the use of the fields that we'll see over the course of 2021. Next slide, please. In Public Works Capital, the Public Works Capital WIP at the end of November was about 1.7. Most of those projects have been completed and expensed out. So there's really nothing there to speak of that needs to carry on. In terms of 2021 capital, we are asking for some funds to support forestry. We will be doing an update to the tree inventory this year. And that will also be part of what helps to develop the forestry operating plan that we're going to do. But in our normal capital, we always have funding for new plantings, and that's included in the 2021 capital. We have the turtle fencing project at Princess Street at Collins Creek. That's represented as part of the Public Works capital for this year. Sports field maintenance, the line painting contract is about $700,000 or $800,000 of the 2.9, and that's our annual line painting and pavement marking budget. And then we have low volume roads budget about $250,000 and some support as well to the patio design review in terms of developing specifications and things for allowing expanded patios that still maintain the accessibility requirements and pedestrian requirements that we need. Next slide, please. Transit budget, not surprisingly, was one of the most difficult budgets to wrap our head around this year, given the impact of COVID. And you know, that Desiree has explained how we've managed to use grant funding to offset it. So the overall variance is almost nothing. So between reducing the service levels and the grant funding that we have, we've been able basically to offset the $4 million revenue reduction that is built into the 2021 budget for transit. So this is the one service where we have planned for incrementally building back up to pre-COVID levels by 2024. And we will be focusing over the next several years on rebuilding the service to the levels that it was at. Our ridership levels right now are, well, at least prior to the shutdown, we're hovering around 45%. And it's on that basis that we planned the revenues for 2021. As has been previously mentioned, we have no planned service enhancements. So any service expansion that we had in the forecasts previously have now been taken out, and we will assess as we go in terms of what we can do. Last piece is we will be introducing in 2021 the first of 2 electric buses into the fleet. These buses were approved last year and ordered actually last year, and we're waiting for them to be delivered. So this will be the first 2, and they will go into service at some point in 2021. The delivery time has been delayed somewhat with COVID, so we're not confident at this point in time exactly when they will arrive, but we know that we will get them over the next few months, hopefully, and then get them into service in 2021. Next slide, please. The transit capital, so there is money in the works in progress, and that is, money includes buses that are ordered, such as the 2 electric ones for sure. So buses and shelters. We're doing some work. There was a Kingston Transit building expansion that was initiated in about 2009 or 2010 when council first started to invest significantly in transit expansion, and there were 2 phases to the study. The building area was expanded at that time was basically to develop the storage garage for the buses and expanding the number of bays in terms of the mechanics area. The next phase is building on that as well and allowing for growth. The reason that we are doing this study right now and why we have money in WIP is because if we decide to go ahead with it, this is something that would likely be funded through ISIP, which is so taking advantage of those grant dollars and trying to use them as best as possible. In terms of new capital for 2021, we are going to be replacing the fare box system. That process will start in 2021. Our system is very, very old and long overdue for replacement, but also will give us the opportunity to add some more modern payment solutions. We also have, as a new item, an installation of driver protection barriers. COVID has really advanced this. It's been a topic of discussion for several years, and some agencies have already moved to have driver protection barriers just to provide protection for the driver from some members of public who might be aggressive or be a threat to them. And Kingston has monitored this, but the requirement of COVID and just the ability to provide that protection is something that we're putting forward. And again, this would be funded from grant money if we were to move forward with it. And then the last piece is, again, funded from COVID funds, multimodal transit and active transportation passenger stations. So these are larger transfer and passenger stations at major or major points along the system that have more amenities to link active transportation and instead of just a shelter. Next slide, please. Solid waste budget is increasing by just over $900,000, and about half of that, or more than half of that, is as a result of the collection contract increases that we've seen that we anticipated last year. And so we have built that into the budget. There will be another adjustment because for 2021, the new contract is effective July 1st. So we'll see an annualization of that contract into 2022 and 2023. The work of Solid Waste Services will be to continue to promote the strategies and looking at options on how to achieve the 65% diversion rate that has been set by Council for 2025. There is a new garbage route, and last year in the capital budget, Council approved the truck for this. And this year, the truck has been ordered. We expect it to arrive within the next 60 days, and then we will put it into service. So we need staff to be able to run that route. And again, that is just to support growth because we've been absorbing growth into the existing routes for several years. And now we just need to optimize them. We will continue over the course of the next few years to monitor, report, and align our services with the federal and provincial waste management regulations that are changing. And that's primarily then related to Blue Box and household hazardous waste. The Blue Box program that is to transition to producer responsibility. We have a date now that Kingston's transition date is 2025. We don't know when in 2025. The first municipalities to transition will happen in 2023. So we'll have more information as we go. We have draft regulations, but not final regulations on this. We expect those to be released we were hoping to have them by end of 2020. So we expect to have them within the next month or so, and then we will report to Council with implications of what that means for Kingston. So just in terms of the operating budget as it relates to the Blue Box program, the operating budget for 21 through to 2024 is based on status quo operations, city operating, doing what we do the way we do it, and isn't anticipating anything different than that. And so yes, so overall increased costs for the new recycling contract are primary cause of the variance for solid waste services. Next slide, please. Solid waste has, at the end of November, was showing $2.4 million works in progress. Much of that was for the maintenance upgrades that were approved last year for the MRF and are underway and completed soon, so that'll be cleared out. We're asking for some minor, $140,000 for some minor site improvements at CARC for 2021, and that is all. Next slide, please. Corporate asset management and fleet. Again, this is a cost center that gets distributed out to the departments it supports. So it's net zero. That's why you're not seeing any funds. But the work of the department on the fleet side will be continuing the electrification of the fleet. And so one of the things that we plan to do in 2021 is an electrification study for the Creekford site as well. Creekford is the location where we operate our solid waste vehicles out of. And during COVID, we started to operate some of our public works services from that location as well. We started that because we needed to not have so many of our workers in one space at one time for lunches and shift changes. But it's also very effective because we call it deadhead time, which would be time from the yard to a route that starts in, for snow clearing, for example, a route that starts in the West End. That drive time is non-productive time. So we're exploring that, and it fits in quite well. We're looking at electrification of this site as an opportunity because there are developments occurring in the industry in terms of electrification for solid waste vehicles. So we're monitoring that. We just need to understand what might happen. And so instead of waiting for that opportunity to come where vehicles are available and then trying to figure out what we would need to do with the building to support it. We are also in 2021, we will be getting ready to begin operating out of the new fleet garage that's being constructed at the Public Works site at 701 Division. And so basically we'll be moving all of our central garage operations into the new site. We're very excited about that, but it will take a significant amount of work to do the move. We are doing work to enhance the management and reporting of our fuel consumption, and again, Ms. Kennedy spoke a lot about fuel and the costs and the things that we're doing to try to really get a handle on that, because it represents a significant portion of our operating budgets. We're also continuing to review fleet utilization. The corporate asset management plan, I've touched on it a couple of times. We will be presenting that to council in terms of the core services, and we are working with the departments to develop the framework so that other departments will also be able to start working on or improve upon existing asset management plans. Looking at charging infrastructure at municipal sites now this charging infrastructure for electric vehicles would be for staff use at our sites, and further leveraging group purchasing programs like the LAS through AMO and anything that we can do to try to take advantage of group purchasing opportunities and reduce our costs. Next slide, please. The capital budget for corporate asset management and fleet is all for fleet. Works in progress, $4.6 million. And those are vehicles that are basically approved or ordered and just haven't been delivered yet. So two of those vehicles, or two of those pieces of equipment are electric ice resurfacers from Zamboni that we will be putting into operation when we're operating ice. And but that's a really good first step for us in terms of electrifying some of our equipment. And there's also in WIP funds to electrify 10 of our light duty vehicles. We are delayed on that, and we pushed those purchases out specifically to help with the with the financial pressures that we were facing in 2020. So we'll carry those over and move on them in 2021. And then in 2021, new funding for life cycle replacements primarily. I answered a few emails today around questions about why we're investing in buses right now. Just to clarify, there are no new buses being asked for purchase in 2021. So there are no funding at all for buses in 2021. We do have bus replacements and new additions to the fleet still modeled in the 15-year capital plan, but there's no approval for those purchases in this budget. Next slide, please. That's it. Happy to take questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions from council? Deputy Mayor Osterhoff.
I put my hand up too fast. I didn't want to go first. It's all good. Thank you for your presentation. From a rural perspective, I guess I'm just wondering for just confirmation with the low volume roads. And you mentioned that the amount of money was 250,000 just dedicated to that. Are you able to be a little more specific? I know that Bill Lennon did call me and I really appreciated some of his time and explanation. But for those that are listening and this is something that's, we obviously have a lot of kilometers of roads in the rural area, and the challenge continues to meet the deterioration that they're experiencing probably faster than we can fix them. I'm just wondering, will we have a list of those roads, and what are the efforts being made to keep up to the maintenance and repairs?
Hello.
Thank you, and through your worship, staff presented a report to council in September that included the 2021 and some of 2022 in terms of our road rehabilitation program. So that list is provided there in that report, Councillor. Happy to reshare that with you and council as well. And the information is also on the My Neighborhood app as well. So if any of your constituents want to take a look at the capital projects that we're managing within engineering, then all that information is also there, whether it's a road or a park or a stormwater or shoreline project. So happy to provide details on a specific request as necessary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just to supplement that, I also provided a link to that report in the budget overview document, just to make it easy as well.
Okay, I was looking for that. Yeah, okay.
Okay, the link is there, Councillor.
Okay, thank you very much.
Next, Councillor Kiley.
Thanks, Mayor Patterson, through you. To Ms. Kidd, first of all, congrats on the continuation of the electrification of the fleet. I think that's very encouraging, and I'm glad to see that again. But I want to actually ask you about the cross guards for the Safe Routes to School program. You mentioned it directly, which is great, because when I was going through the numbers, I noticed that there was only about $45,000 additional allocated to crossing guards. And you said that that will be for 3 different locations. So is it that each new crossing guard is approximately $15,000?
Through you, your worship. So so that would start in September. So yes, it would be $15,000, but that would cover the period September. They're budgeted for September through December of 2021.
Right. Okay. So over the course of the school year, it would be more than that, but we just don't see it. Our fiscal year divides it. Okay. So maybe.
Right. It would be annualized in the 2022 budget.
Okay. Yeah, good. I was glad to see it. It was a lower cost than I thought it would be, and it encourages me to maybe pursue that further and see more money to that in future years. So thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? Councillor Neal.
Thank you. Couple of things. First of all, I want to applaud both Public Works and Transit. Throughout the COVID issues that we've had, both services have really operated well. And I've heard from constituents that that's the case. So I really appreciate that. A couple of things. There's just over $11 million in contracted services. Now I know a chunk of that is probably we contract out the servicing of CARC, the handling station, and some others. Could you tell me where the bulk of those contracted services go towards?
Through you, your worship. They are spread in the department. So yes, for example, in solid waste, we have contracts that collect waste at municipal sites. We have contractors that run our household hazardous waste depot, yard waste depot. We have contractors that do collection of recyclables in the east and west portions of the city. So that's an example of the types of contracts that we have in solid waste. In public works, we have contracts for winter maintenance in the east of the city. We have contracts for some grass cutting and boulevard maintenance. I can provide a greater list. I think of in terms of the other departments, the significant ones. I might, if I could, through you, Mr. Mayor, is just ask if any of my directors would like to add to that if they have for this.
That would be great, or you could send me a list tomorrow as well.
I'm more than happy to send you a list of the major items, and I can send that through you, Councillor Neal, and I'm happy to provide it to all of council if that's the desire.
I appreciate that. We also have a very good engineering department, but it's been brought to my attention that most of our engineers work on supervising contracted services, either supervising other engineers doing contracted services or construction contracted services. Is that accurate? Thank you, Luke. Mr. Fowler.
Thank you, and through your worship, Councillor, from a contracted service perspective within our department, most recently and the largest piece that we have participated in is on the most recent John Connor Boulevard and Bridge project, where we utilized a third-party quality assurance team to verify and provide some contract administration. So that's certainly the big ticket item for us on those large, more higher risk projects. Whereas on our road rehabilitation projects, all of that work is done in-house. So in the past, in this year or last year, 2020 and 2021, we'll be managing about $6 million in-house in terms of capital works. And that's from pulling the packages together, putting them on the market, and then contract admin, inspection with our team members of our survey inspector team. So majority of that, or all of that on the rehab side is done in-house. So we do have other contracted services or external services provided through geotechnical investigations, where again, we'd like a third party to provide that expertise, and we will then certainly review it and do a quality control on it. But those are minimal in terms of our annual budget, $20,000 to $25,000 in terms of that geotechnical testing work that's done, and that could be helping us inform the decisions that we're making in terms of the type of work we're going to do, but also verifying that what our contractors are putting on the road is what we're asking for in our specifications.
I appreciate that. And I guess my concern is, and I mentioned this in advance, is that in a time of COVID, when things are somewhat slowing down within the city, I think it might be an opportunity to do less contracting out and to do more, I hate to say contracting in, but actually doing some of that work we used to externalize, but doing it with our existing staff, which allows us to secure their employment as well. So.
Thank you, and through you and to members of council, throughout the pandemic, all of our members of engineering continued to work. We did not have any members that were redeployed, and we were able to deliver on a majority of our projects, and certainly the ones that we committed to that weren't deferred. And we certainly want to use the skills and abilities of our team members in order to continue to deliver those in-house, because certainly there are efficiencies that can be realized, and we can certainly more efficiently address issues that might arise in the field. And it's a benefit to all of our team. And
great. And those engineers would be working on site, not just working from home.
That's correct. Our survey inspectors have been working on site throughout the duration. So they have attended the John Connor Boulevard facility in the morning at the end of the shift, but otherwise they're on site doing the work that we need in terms of monitoring the projects, but also preparing for the next round of projects.
Great. Thank you. And I look forward to the further information from your other departments, Ms. Kidd. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Stanek.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you, one question about transportation. And a few years ago, we made the commitment, the city made the commitment that all the traffic lights would get pedestrian countdowns. And then I know that we took that, or we stopped doing, like 20 intersections a year this is a few years ago. I just wondered if we're going to start doing that again, if there's any intersections in this year's budget. Like one that I drive by a lot is Bath Road and Coverdale. And I think Bath Road and Portsmouth Avenue still doesn't have a pedestrian countdown in all directions, or maybe not in any directions. And since we're getting the report for 2022 about the red light cameras, that was part of the motion that we passed in December 2019, is that whatever intersections do go ahead with red light cameras, that they would have a pedestrian countdown. So I just wanted to ask about that.
Mr. Semple, Mr. Mayor, should be up there, I guess.
Through you, Your Worship, Councillor, thank you for your question. So we have a number of infrastructure programs that are related to the intersections and to pedestrian crossings. So where we are doing work at an intersection, we do upgrade and add those pieces in if they are not there. But we also are adding in a number of new signalized pedestrian crossings. So there are 4 crossings that are being constructed this year in 2021. And as Ms. Kidd alluded earlier in her presentation, with the award of the ISIP funding, the city has sort of 2, I think, main opportunities as it relates to our signalized intersections and crossings. One is we've been awarded funding that will allow us to do many more pedestrian crossings. So we'll be bringing a report to EIT in February that outlines a preliminary list of locations where those crossings can be constructed beyond the 4 that we've already committed. And we also have funding that is related to centralizing our traffic signal system and upgrading equipment so that we can provide for transit priority. Those upgrades as well give us the opportunity to do other upgrades at the intersections at the same time, including adding pedestrian countdowns. The pieces as it relates to red light cameras, that component that was part of the motion is part of the analysis that's being done, and we would consider that and bring that forward as part of those locations that's coming forward shortly.
Okay. Thank you for that, and about how we might consider more pedestrian crossings. So I'll move on to another question, but I just wanted to say that for those 2 intersections I mentioned, Bath and Coverdale, I was just talking about where when it's green, you get the walking person and then you start to get the flashing hand. But then we have a lot of intersections that then click on to 12 seconds, 11, 10, 9, that type of countdown. So that's what we had put in the December 2019 motion, was that any intersection that will be getting one of those red light cameras would have that countdown of like 15, 14. So just wanted to be clear of that. That's what I was talking about. For the waste management section of the presentation, I don't remember, for that additional garbage route, is that in Woodhaven or is that over on Highway 15 with the new development subdivisions in there?
Through you, Councillor, thank you. So the route, the route's divided over 5 days. So it's in various locations because we collect over 5 days. So it's not just one section. We're going to repan the route. The route is separated through different sections. But it's mostly starting to core. It is mostly in the areas where we've seen growth, where we're going to be adjusting our route. And it's only for garbage.
Okay, thanks, Director Gardner. Then I have two other questions that are also about waste. And I know that you're new, so maybe Commissioner Kidd has to go in, but where we have in our package that when we sell the recyclables that we collect in our blue box, and it's sales of nearly $1 million per year, I just wondered, has COVID affected that resale? Like over the past many years, whenever we've kind of been in a recession, it's been harder for the city to sell our blue box material to third parties, and our revenues have fallen for the blue box sales. So I just wondered, with COVID, has that, like, did the market kind of fall off in 2020, or has it been like kind of held constant compared to 2019?
It's thank you for the question. It's the materials that we sold, the revenues that we got are very similar to what we had in the previous years.
Okay, that's great too. So COVID didn't have a big impact on that. That's good. And then my last question is just about bag tag sales. And so we have in our package that usually we make about 300,000 by selling that second bag, third bag of garbage. I just wondered, over the years, has that been increasing? Like, are more people tending to buy bag tags, or has that 300,000 been pretty consistent?
That number I will have to confirm. I don't know, and I don't have that offhand from the history. So I'd have to confirm that for you.
Okay.
And through you, Mr. Mayor, it's been pretty consistent. Nothing too serious. There was contemplation of increasing the cost of a bag tag, which would put the revenue up, but that is not something that we built into the 2021 budget.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much.
Next is Councillor Chappelle.
Thank you, Your Worship. I appreciate the presentation. Very clear and succinct, very professional. It's great to have a presentation like that to follow along. I do have a couple questions. The electrical feasibility study for the Kingston Transit busing, I cannot believe that's going to cost $250,000. Are we contracting that out, or is that Utilities Kingston billing us?
Through you, Your Worship. So that's a item. It's a capital item that was approved last year. It's an estimate. What we would definitely be contracting it out. It's not something that we're capable of doing in-house. Utilities Kingston would be participating and providing information to that. What we're trying to do, though, and what's interesting is we have been a member of an organized group called QTRIC, and they are putting a submission into the federal government for grant funding to do these types of electrical feasibility studies. And so we have been in conversation with them, and we're hoping that if they're successful, we will do the study through them on a grant basis and not have to use that fund. It's much more than just a study of what the building needs and what the infrastructure currently provides. It's also the demand on the battery life, and it could be quite extensive. If we do it ourselves, we won't go as extensive as that. So we are hoping that because the federal government has announced that they have significant funds that they're going to put to electrification, but they haven't announced how they will go about that. So we're fairly confident that that they will be happy to partner with QTRIC and fund QTRIC, who has significant knowledge in this area.
Okay, it just cautions me every time I see a consultancy fee type of expense, just always, you know, it says City of Kingston needs double the price. It just drives me crazy. And I'm so glad the federal government can continue to print money. That's awesome. The Kingston Transit expansion, I know that we're deferring all of those routes that were supposed to come online, so Woodhaven and those areas, and I guess Westbrook, they'll have a tough time because they're not getting a bus anytime soon from the plans, and I can appreciate that. And it really saddens me that transit is down as much as it is. So I'm wondering, is there a need to build the bus shelters this year? That's $1.36 million. Can we not defer that for another year?
Those shelters are funded through ISIP funding. So we're basically 28 cents on the dollar is what it's costing us.
Okay, that's fine. No, I didn't realize it was ISIP. That's absolutely fine, Ms. Kidd. I'm just trying to look at where
understood
flexibility. So one of the other items that I've noticed is that you're looking to, and I've always questioned, we end up having this debate in council because we come forward with a proposal to purchase a vehicle and we only had one bid on it, so it has to come to council. And that purchasing procurement process really is befuddles me, to say the least. And what I see that you were looking to purchase 10 light duty vehicles, which would mean that they would be a vehicle from any manufacturer per se. I would like to encourage the fleet management to seriously consider leasing vehicles through, a company like Enterprise Leasing, rather than owning a vehicle that depreciates. You got a huge capital outlay and the ongoing maintenance, and especially dealing with electric vehicles. Once they get beyond, 150,000 kilometers, it gets into more costly issues with battery maintenance. It would be much better to lease a vehicle like that and return it after 3, 4, 5 years than actually own a depreciating asset. It's a cost. It's not an asset. Vehicles are never an asset for cost. So can we at least consider or commit to considering leasing rather than purchasing?
I'd like to turn that question over because I think we're already there. I'd like to turn that question over to our director, Mr. Fowler, please.
Fowler, go ahead.
Hi, through you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks for the question, Councillor. So as part of the review of some of the procurement programs through LAS, there has been some preliminary discussions with Enterprise on looking at their fleet acquisition solution on some of our light duty vehicles and some existing leases that we have in the city on some assets, vehicle assets that are expiring, which would be more favorable to conduct through the Enterprise solution. And we have that obviously through our representation with LAS.
It's very positive news. Thank you, Mr. Fowler. And then I guess another item that seems to be a cost incurring item that happens in every budget, I see, and it's not just your department or division, it's for telecommunications, transit communications, $500,000. And then we have fire and rescue mobile units, $1.53 million. And then fire tech communications, $240,000. And then you go to other departments, it's all these communications. Policing has another, I can't remember what it was, I looked at the other day. But it's $1 million plus. We're all one city. Can we not have one coordinated communication system? Is there anything that can be done to find some synergies? Because it just seems that we're paying through the nose for communication systems, and I end up with this emergency services type situation. You've got different communication systems.
Well, I wonder if that's a better question for
corporate services.
No, I'll take it.
S&T, but Mr. Kidd, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so in fact, through your worship, we actually do. We have one common communication system that is shared by Utilities Kingston, Fire, Police, Transit. You will see, though, that the costs are in each of the individual budgets to support it. But that was a project, it was a fairly significant project that was undertaken about 5 years ago. And so that is a common system that you're seeing between police, fire, utilities, and transit. And it's basically their radio and dispatch system.
And so what we're seeing in your individual budget for transit communications is your proportion of that shared cost.
Precisely.
That makes sense now. I'm glad, I'm very pleased that there's synergies. That makes me very appreciate the fact that the city's working together so cooperatively. That's awesome. I think that's really what I have at this point. Thank you very much for your clear and succinct presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, so I'm just looking at our time. It's 9:10. What I would propose, just so that we can pace things out over tonight and tomorrow, I would suggest we'll do one more presentation this evening, and then we will recess until tomorrow at 6. So with that, then we will move to our second department presentation, community services, and we'll turn the floor over to Commissioner Agnew to take us through that.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson and Council. I'm happy to be here tonight on behalf of Community Services. I'm joined with a couple of my colleagues, Lisa Kapner-Hunt, who is our Chief Building Official, and also our Director of Building and Enforcement Services. And Casey Keys is also on the call with us tonight. She's our Director and Administrator of Rideau Crest. So 2020 for Community Services, well, it was a pretty busy year. It was pretty hectic. Our group overall is just about 310 employees, and we're all frontline service providers. So 2020 was full of a lot of changes and adaptation, and certainly a lot of hard work on behalf of the city. And I'm proud of the work that we did in 2020. I think we've got a remarkable group, and just a couple of highlights in terms of some of the work that was done. So our building department, they're a pretty small group of people, but overall they processed 2,065 building permits. So that's a testament to the amount of building activity going on in the community, as well as that's reflected in what we're seeing in future years in tax assessment growth. So that was super positive. Our planning group, again, we're about 25 people in planning. They processed over 1,200 applications in 2020 on top of delivering some really important policy work. So that was a really busy year for the planning group, and we continue to have a lot of work to do over the next couple of years, especially on the policy side. With respect to the enforcement group, we did see some growth in that group this year, and they were a frontline service provider with respect to COVID enforcement. They did over 9,300 enforcement cases in 2020. 8,000 animal registrations and over 650 business licenses. So despite the pandemic, our group and community services continued to provide continuous service. And on the Rideau Crest side, the 240 employees that worked at Rideau Crest provided exceptional level of care for over 152 residents. Next slide, please. So overall, in terms of our budget, you can see where we were in 2020 at about 8.3 million. We have seen some increases in the 2021 budget up to 8.9 million. Overall, that's a variance for us of about 7.23%. And I've got some slides that break that down by department to be able to explain the variances and the increases that you see. Next slide, please. In terms of the capital budget, we're looking at about 600,000 for planning services, 210,000 for building and enforcement services, and about 343,000 for long-term care Rideau Crest. Next slide, please. So in terms of some key highlights, looking at the planning services group and what we're going to be focusing on in 2021, of course, the completion of some very important planning studies that have been underway for the last couple of years, the Central Kingston Growth Strategy, and we're on track to be delivering that this spring. The North Kingstown Secondary Plan is still being worked on in the background. And the Density by Design Phase 2 is a project that we're looking to scope in 2021. One of the most important things that we're putting most of our priority behind in 2021 is also the delivery of the city's new comprehensive zoning bylaw. We're also going to be looking to develop and implement strategies in conjunction with the Mayor's Task Force on Housing to look at additional ways to accelerate construction of residential units. Next slide, please. So overall, we've seen an 11.2% variance from 2020 to 2021. That's mostly because of the annualized impact of our restructuring. So 2020, on top of the pandemic, was a busy year for community services, just in terms of some of the corporate changes that happened. And that's really what is a product of planning services having its own independent director and building and enforcement services having its own independent director. Council may recall that prior to me being promoted to the Commissioner of Community Services, I was the Director of Planning, Building, and Licensing Services. So we did that structural change as part of the org change in 2020, and you're seeing that annualized expense represented in the 2021 budget. In terms of our works in progress, again, we have some funds associated with the comprehensive zoning bylaw, the North Kingstown secondary plan, the central growth infill strategy, again, which we're completing this year, as well as the zoning bylaw. And there are some works that were left associated with the Williamsville Main Street update that we completed in 2020. And there's some detailed transportation modeling that's completing this year in 2021. In terms of our capital asks for 2021 in planning services, some additional funds associated with the completion of the zoning bylaw, some secondary plan studies, again, the completion of Central Kingston and the scoping of phase 2 of density by design, and also further implementation of our GIS master plan. Next slide, please. So for building and enforcement services, some key highlights looking forward. Again, we're looking at building permit revenues, expecting them to remain stable. We did have an exceptional year in 2020, despite the pandemic, and we had a strong year in 2019 as well. Overall, in 2020, we saw 1,407 new residential units that moved to construction, and that's compared to 953 that we saw in 2019. So compared to what our normal 10-year average is at 590 per year, we've had 2 exceptionally strong years of building. We're going to be continuing to work on partnerships with Queens and St. Lawrence College to improve property standards and bylaw strategies associated with move-in and move-out, as well as other events. St. Patrick's Day, I know we've seen some lower activity associated with the pandemic, but there is still a lot of activity in the community, and we need to continue to work on those partnerships, and we have a strong commitment with the post-secondary institutions in that respect. Continuing to strengthen community relationships through stakeholder engagement and collaboration on service expectations. Looking to do a lot of education and awareness building with respect to building code safety for second residential units in 2021. We did bring in zoning bylaw changes in 2019 with respect to second units, but what we did find actually a lot in 2020 was quite a bit of illegal construction on second units. And I think some of that is really based on there being a bit of a gap in education. So we have some ideas about how we can provide some focused communication strategies and additional educational opportunities to help ensure that second units being built within the city are done so from a safe perspective, and of course in compliance with the building code, and most importantly, obtaining permits where they're required. We're looking at an increased fee for service and bylaw compliance. We saw some of that come in with respect to some of the COVID compliance and the introduction of administrative monetary policies, or penalties, sorry, we refer to them as AMPs. We're looking at opportunities to expand our AMP program to consider additional bylaws from what we've implemented so far. It's an excellent frontline enforcement tool that actually diverts a number of things out of the court system as an initial pass. It does create a little bit of a revenue opportunity for the municipality as well, because when court system cases go through the court system, the province actually ends up taking whatever type of fines are imposed through that process. So again, this keeps the enforcement activity more at the municipal level, and it also deals with the issue of all of the backlog in the court system that has built up through courts not operating with the same level of efficiency through the pandemic. We're going to be continuously improving DASH, our development and services hub, and expanding to include licensing and enforcement in terms of the DASH system. We have DASH that's available for planning services and building services, and now we're continuing to build the third component of our business so that all 3 services will be on one enterprise system, and there'll be one online access for the public to access all of those services. And we're also going to be introducing short-term rental licensing as part of the information that was presented to council in late 2020. And that bylaw is set to come into effect in June of 2021. Next slide, please. In terms of the building enforcement services budget, key thing with the building budget is because it's a self-funded department, it's not on the tax base. It has its own reserve fund and it's funded directly from building permit activity and revenues associated with permitting. So it is a little bit different than many of the operational departments that are funded from the tax base. In terms of the 2020 to 2021 budget, we do see an increase there and a variance from year over year. And that's, again, mostly related to the additional director position that's now solely focused on building and enforcement services. And that director position was filled by Lisa Capener-Hunt late in 2020. Also, we did experience revenue loss due to COVID, mostly related to the bingo operation because of reduced capacity and periods of time when bingo wasn't operating at all. Bingo is still operating at a reduced capacity. So we have anticipated that to continue through to the end of 2021. We've also identified some additional revenue opportunities, as I explained, through the expansion of our AMP program. And then we've also projected additional costs due to enforcement activities. We have 5 enforcement officers that were introduced on a short-term contract just to be completed to the end of 2021 to assist with COVID-related enforcement. So that's reflected in the variance as well. Overall, for this group, they have a small amount of money in the WIP or works in progress, $78,000, and that is to do with field hardware and equipment replacement. Again, as we're moving more of our services to online, we have to upgrade our equipment to do with being able to access that technology in the field for the building inspectors as well as for the enforcement agents as well, so that they're able to input data and do all of that work in the field remotely, as opposed to having to drive back to the office and input it. That was sort of the old manual way. We've accelerated past that point. It requires some equipment replacement. In terms of the 2021 capital, again, we have some money in there for expanding the DASH implementation to include licensing and enforcement services. Next slide, please. In terms of long-term care and Rideau Crest, some key highlights for 2021. We're actively preparing for the accreditation survey in the fall of 2021. That was meant to happen in 2020, but was delayed because of the pandemic. So the staff will be actively working to prepare for that process. Again, looking to continuously build upon the community partnerships and work together with the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, our local health integration network and Kingston Frontenac Health Unit, and Accreditation Canada on improvements and legislative requirements. Through the pandemic, there's been a continuous wave of changes with respect to long-term care and looking at new legislation and compliance. So there will be a lot of ongoing work with respect to that piece. There's also going to be work with respect to the implementation of operational and funding changes that have been communicated by the province with respect to the long-term care staffing plan, and that's set to begin in 2021 and will continue through 2025. This group has to continue and has for several years, but there's a lot more work to do in terms of thinking proactively about the human resource component of running long-term care and the number of staff that we require that need to be certified and qualified in various healthcare fields. So there'll be continued work with human resources to look at all the ways we can to maximize healthcare worker recruitment and retention. And we have partnerships with respect to some of our local educational institutions to look at how we can partner with them in the preparation of additional people coming out of school and being qualified healthcare workers, and looking to align them with future employment opportunities at Rideau Crest. So this is very important, again, especially in terms of not only maintaining the level of care that we have now, but also in anticipation of moving to the 4 hour of resident care per day that's been suggested by the province as being a priority and will be a requirement as we move forward once the province brings more information forward about how it's actually going to be funded. There's going to be continued work, of course, with the province and KFLNA to battle COVID-19 to ensure the health and safety of the residents and staff at Rideau Crest Home. Certainly there's been exceptional work that's been done by the Rideau Crest team throughout 2020 with respect to all of the pandemic care regulations, certainly enforcement and making sure that everything's being done in the home from a quality care management perspective. And thankfully, we've been very fortunate not to see any cases of COVID within Rideau Crest in 2020. Next slide, please. Some other key highlights, we have some major capital projects that are on the go, and these plans are done in conjunction with facility management services. So I'm sure there will be some additional information that's offered by that group. These are really types of projects that are focused on compliance with the Ministry of Health's infection control standards. The key project that's ongoing right now and was able to continue through the pandemic with exceptional detail to infection control practices on behalf of the contractor has been with the continuation of flooring replacement. So this has been an ongoing project. You can see a photo here. It really doesn't do it justice, but the flooring replacement that has been able to take place so far is really important from an infection control perspective and cleanliness. So that will continue. There is work that's going to be done looking to expand the main living room and dining rooms on all 4 of the terraces to ensure the ability of adequate physical distancing for all residents. And this has been directed by the ministry, again, with respect to infection control best practices. So that will continue. That work will go in 2021. Also looking to renovate and modernize all resident tub and shower rooms to meet accessibility, safety, and infection control requirements. So that's a capital project that is slated to move forward in 2021, and also looking at beginning renovations and modernizations of all resident washrooms to meet both safety and infection control requirements. Next slide, please. So in terms of the 2020 to 2021 budget and looking at the increased variance there of 3.73%, just to summarize the key elements of that, a lot of this has to do with an increase in compensation costs or wage inflation, so it's reflected in that increase. There's also an increase in a life enrichment position. So this type of position is primarily focused on doing all types of programming for the residents that are in the home. And this additional position is meant to be in place to provide coverage for nights and weekends, but also for the key person that's doing that position full time if they take vacations, to make sure there's continuous provision of lots of life enrichment for the residents. We did see and achieve a decrease in contracted services with Expenditure. That was achieved in 2020 with a reduction from what would used to be a $12,000 monthly expense down to $7.5 or $7,500 per month. We've seen an increase in some provincial funding, and that really had to do with the pandemic. Increased contributions to the capital reserve fund, so that 3% is what's required as part of 2021, and then also some increased costs of facility maintenance and accommodation. So that's all reflected in that 3.73% variance that you see for 2021. In terms of the works in progress or the WIPs, again, that's associated with money that is continuing associated with the flooring upgrades to all resident home areas. So that work will continue, and that money will be spent in 2021 as the remainder of the flooring is replaced. And there's also some additional capital in there, $343,000 to do with equipment and furnishing replacements within some of the areas of the home, provincial subsidies for minor capital funding, and then also some capital donations as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the Commissioner's Office budget, this budget primarily is just to do with my salary and that of my administrative support. You do see a change here, and the primary reason for that is that the Commissioner position previously was partially funded with transfers from capital, and that is no longer happening. So that that position or this position is no longer having any component of it that is recovered from capital. So that's why you see such a significant variance. Next slide, please. Happy to take any questions. Again, I have Ms. Kapner-Hunt and Ms. Keys on the call to assist with any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from Council. Councillor Neal.
Thank you. And I want to tell you how excited I am that comprehensive zoning is on. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. That's great. COVID enforcement. First of all, your department is doing a great job of that. I don't know what other councillors, but in my district, I've had reported breaches, and very quickly they're attended to. So I really appreciate that. Now the fines, am I right that the fine goes to the province rather than the municipality, or is it a shared fine?
Thank you, and through you, great question. So it depends on the nature of the fine and the piece of legislation that's being used to administer the fine. So the administrative monetary penalties that we have in place with respect to some of the COVID enforcement, those fines are collected and those are held by the municipality only. If an individual or a business is charged and it goes through the provincial court system, and it goes through a trial and it goes through all of that detailed administrative process, any fines that are levied by a justice of the peace or a judge as part of that process, the majority of them do go to the province. The municipality sees a small amount of them. So that's where the difference is between if it goes through a provincial court process versus something that's the administrative monetary penalty process that's solely managed by the municipality. We keep all of the fines associated with.
And would the majority of the enforcement dollars be municipal then, or would the majority of them end up being provincial?
I think historically, Councillor, what we're trying to do with the expansion of the AMP program, and you will be receiving reports on this at Council, is actually trying to shift to the degree of what we take through the provincial court system and try to do a lot more enforcement at the municipal level. So I think historically, the most of the enforcement has happened through the provincial court system. That's why we're trying to implement an expanded municipal administrative penalty program here. We started it in 2020. We have desires to expand it to many more bylaws, like the yards bylaw, solid waste bylaw, potentially using it for heritage related infractions as well. There's a number of things that we're looking at right now to try to shift historically what has been more provincially based to looking at doing as much as we can municipally and reserving the provincial route only if there's like continuous non-compliance.
That's reassuring, because it does sound like a form of downloading if we're paying for the enforcement and they're receiving the bulk of the funds and fines. I'm very happy to hear that a large portion of the contracted services at Rideau Crest have been reduced, and I really appreciate that. There is some contracted services that remain within your budget. Could you tell me whereabouts they go? Because I know, for instance, when we do peer reviews, it's not something that we pay for. It's something that the developer pays for, the bulk of. So, but where else do we spend on contracted services?
Sure. I'll start with planning services first. So we do have about 115,000 in contracted services in the planning budget, and that is really related to external legal fees. So as you know, we have a number of LPAT appeals. So we do rely upon some experts in the community and municipal planning law that we don't yet have the capacity in-house to be able to support that work on our own. So we have the majority of contracted service associated with that external legal support. And then we also have about $4,000 that's set aside in the development group budget. And that's, sometimes we do peer reviews on our own that aren't associated with something that maybe an applicant would need to do. So we have a very small amount of money, but typically if it's associated with a development application, typically speaking, the applicant is paying for that, as you've noted, but we have a very small amount just in case. And we have a very small amount in policy planning, about $5,000 just there as a placeholder in case something came up where we needed to obtain some type of advice that we don't have, in-house within our expertise.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Kiley.
Try that again. Through you, Mayor Patterson. Ms. Agnew, you mentioned that on average we have, I think it was 953 units going to construction over the last 2 years, which is up from somewhere in the 500s. Do you have a sense in the moment of whether that's from a few big projects, or is that multiple little projects that would make up that increase?
Yep, that's a great question, and thank you. So the 10-year average, if you look at 10 years worth of permit data, the average is about 590. So what we've seen in the 950 or so we saw last year and the over 2,400 we saw this year represents exceptional years of building for the city of Kingston. What we did see when you break it down by unit type, certainly there has been a chunk both in 2019 and 2020 that's been really related to multi-residential buildings, but we also have seen pretty strong housing starts with respect to low density forms as well, single family homes, some semi-detached, townhomes for sure. And that definitely we've seen a very strong uptake in second units, particularly since we made the implementing changes with respect to the zoning so that they're allowed as of right in most areas of the city, except for if there's servicing constraints.
Mm-hmm. And how this relates to the budget, I'm wondering ultimately, is there a standard fee per unit, or is it based on the different built forms that you just described, multi-residential, single family? Like, would there be different dollars that go with those different unit counts?
Just to clarify, Councillor, do you mean in terms of the actual cost of the building permit?
Yeah, I guess if it's just the building permit that we're generating funds from, I'm just wondering if units are created equal when it comes to revenue for the city.
In terms of overall payback, taxation, development charges, all of the above?
Yeah, on aggregate, just roughly speaking.
Definitely there's, for development charges, there's different rates with respect to bachelors and singles, and it changes as you get into larger units specifically. I actually may ask Ms. Keepner-Hunt, she's much more of an expert in all the fee breakdown than I am. There are definitely some different rates, and there's to say we're more profitable in one area than another. The fees are specifically crafted to be a self-funding program. So we don't actually want to make a whole lot of money or excess money from the permitting process, or else the development industry will tell us that our fees are too high. It's meant to be a self-sustaining system. There is some buffer to allow for years where you may exceed what you require to cover your operational needs. And that's where we have the brag fund. So in those years, we make some contributions, but certainly in downturn years where there's less housing starts, less construction based on a variety of factors that are likely maybe nationally or internationally influenced, or could just be locally, then we have the brag fund to be able to extract funds to help balance the operational budget.
Yeah.
Lisa, do you want to add anything in additional with respect to the breakdown of costs by permit?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Agnew, and through you, Mayor Patterson. Our permit fees are based on square meter rates. So depending on what type of use it is, so residential, there's a different rate for multi and duplex multi-units than there is for single, semi, and rows, as well as any other type of construction. It just changes per square meter.
Okay, but because it's revenue neutral, there's no economic incentive for the city to approve or disapprove different types of units.
I suppose you could probably broaden that, though, to think about tax revenue and net financial impact. I think that it's actually a discussion we had a number of years ago at council that looked at the net financial impact of different types of development, and there were some interesting findings that came out of that, but I don't have the details.
And I'm happy to leave it at that for now. This is something that I can pursue at another time. Get straying a bit far, that's fine. Thanks.
What I will add for council's benefit is I think the exact nature of some of the questions you're asking are going to be answered by the life cycle analysis study that is scheduled to be completed in 2021 as well. It wasn't listed in my list of highlights, but it is essentially trying to evaluate that very type of question by type of development.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, are there any other questions? Going once. Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of technical questions. We have the bylaw and property standards extended service for Sydenham and Williamsville districts, and it includes the downtown BIA. Does that follow essentially the Heritage District geographical boundaries, or is it a little wider than that? I'm saying because I've referred people to it in not this past year, but in years before that, and seem to get action on Thursdays and Fridays sometimes for like loud parties and stuff. Or am I the two programs together?
So definitely there's two things depending on the type of infraction you're talking about, Councillor. So certainly the additional support that we have in place for the near campus neighborhoods, and then also for the downtown, the BIA position. That position is really focused on the downtown and working with business owners there on cleanliness and any type of issues related to there. We do have specific zones set up in the city where we've got dedicated people associated with those zones, and they're broken up by geography all over the city. The night noise enforcement, if you're talking about nighttime parties, that's a little bit different. We have 3 officers for the whole city, and they do work on Thursdays through Saturdays from about 8 p.m. to 3 a.m. and they work in lockstep with police. Most of the calls actually go into the police unit themselves, but they're often busy doing other types of police work. So then the call gets dispatched to our night enforcement officers, and there's the 3 of them that are providing that service. And sometimes, depending on the time of year, they can be quite busy.
Okay, thank you. You answered my other question while you were doing that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions at this point. So thank you, Commissioner Agnew. And at this point, 9:42, I propose that we will recess and reconvene at 6 p.m. tomorrow to continue the department presentations and then to move into our budget deliberations. Thank you, and we'll see you